everyone, and thank you so much for joining us on day 2 of India Science Festival's 3rd edition. ISF 2022 is very excited to host you all. We are the flagship science communication event under FAST India, which is a newly formed organization. FAST India stands for the Foundation for Advancing Science and Technology India, and we're based in New Delhi. It's 6 p.m. IST in India, and we're so excited to host you all at this session here today. We are going to have we are going to host a lot of panels, talks, workshops, competitions, contests at this festival. The festival is themed around continuum. We're looking at where we've come from and where we are headed. And, the festival is a real massive celebration of science. We're looking at how we can involve all members of the public. We're looking at global participation from all over. We're really excited for this public engagement platform to grow. We want to celebrate science with all of you. The festival is completely online and it's free to attend. All of our events are accessible on our website. You can find them in the chat. We're going to drop some links in the chat, and you can stay tuned with us throughout the course of this festival. It's running from the 8th to the 23rd of January, and we're very active on all our social media platforms. So check us out on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter. We post live updates every single day, and participate in our social media contests. Take a screen grab of our events. Tell us what you really liked. Tell us what you didn't like. Tag us on social media. Use the hashtags ISF 2022, Continuum, Science for All, and SciComm, and we make sure that the best tweets get exciting prizes. We have so many exciting events lined up for you all across these 15 days. Please make sure to tell your friends and family members about the festival and join us. We would have loved to meet you all offline in an on-ground setting and experience science with everyone. But owing to the pandemic, we've taken our events online and are making the best of whatever we can in this under the circumstances. So do make sure that you avail of all the opportunities. This is an exciting opportunity to get to know about the latest science and technology innovation that's happening all over the world. We have some world-class speakers joining us for talks, fireside chats, panels. We have some exciting demonstrations from various technology labs. We also have a very fun contest running, like a photography contest, a meme contest, social media contest. So make sure to tune in because there's something to do for everyone at this festival. We also have a kids corner at the festival where we have specific workshops only for kids. So do check them out on our website. And with that, I'm going to just hand over to our moderator of the day, who's going to be taking us across the panel discussion for day 2. It's about the history of science and its coming of age. And it's a very exciting topic. And I'm sure you're all very interested to know more. So I'm going to hand over the mic to Banya. Banya is a science communicator and public engagement practitioner and has been associated with us for the past few months and has moderated various events. Banya, thank you for joining us here today. It's such a pleasure to host you at ISF once again. And with that, I would request you to take it forward, introduce our panelists, and take the session ahead. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shruti. Very happy to be joining everyone at the India Science Fest 2022. Hello, everyone. I trust you all are doing very well today and staying safe. I welcome you all to today's panel discussion, where we will delve into the history of science and its coming of age, especially in the Indian context. Study the past if you would define the future, said Confucius a very long time ago. And this is what we will try to do today by investigating the history of science, its evolution through the years, how global interactions, conflicts, exchanges, and changing times and conditions have shaped science, its practice, and more particularly its development, and how we can draw from learnings of the past to address challenges of the future. I really hope that we all will be able to catalyze great conversations today as the most extraordinary selection of panelists join us in action. I welcome Janvi Falke, a filmmaker and historian of science and technology, Formerly at King's College London, Janvi is now the founding director of Science Gallery, Bengaluru, and Sir Ashutosh Mukherjee, visiting professor at the National Institute of Advanced Studies. Janvi has explored the history of science in India extensively and has authored Atomic State, Big Science in 20th Century India. She has also co-edited Science of Giants, China and India in the 20th Century. She is on the editorial board for the British Journal for the History of Science and History and Technology. She is the director-producer of the documentary film Cyclotron. Thank you for joining us today, Janvi. We also have on the panel Dhruv Raina, a leading philosopher and historian of science in India, best known for his work on domestication of science in colonial India, transnational intellectual networks of science, and historiographies of science. His research has focused on the politics and cultures of scientific knowledge in South Asia. Over the last couple of years, he has been working on cultures of history and science policy in post-colonial South Asia and the social theory of science and mathematics. Currently, he is a professor at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Dhruv has co-edited Situating the History of Science Dialogues with Joseph Needham and Social History of Sciences in Colonial India, and more recently, Science Between Europe and Asia. He has co-authored Domesticating Modern Science, a social history of science and culture in colonial India. He has published extensively on related subjects in journals of history and philosophy of science, social studies of science, and social and political history. Welcome, Dhruv. I hope you'll enjoy your time with us today. Also joining us today is science journalist and author Hari Pulakat, who won the Indira Gandhi Prize for Popularization of Science in 2020. He has spent 3 decades of his career writing for the Economic Times and Business World. He's the editor of Shastra, a science and technology magazine published by IIT Madras. Hari's recent book, Space, Life, Matter, The Coming of Age of Indian Science, brings to readers the path-breaking contributions made by India's scientists to original research and what they mean to the nation's progress. It is the celebration of the achievements of some of the enterprising scientists and under very trying circumstances who have tried to build the science infrastructure of India from scratch. Welcome to the panel, Hari. I will open the discussion with specific questions to each of the panelists based on their field of work and interest, and then steer the conversation to topics of broader interest. We welcome questions from our audience, which we will take at the end of the discussion. Therefore, I request our audience to please keep dropping their questions in the chat box for our panelists. And now, diving straight into our discussion, I'll perhaps start with Janvi. Janvi, based on your previous work, I wanted to explore with you and compare the development of science, specifically in India and China. I have a sense that in the 1980s and the 1990s, science done in India was viewed to be more mature and better developed than that was in China. However, the situation seems to have changed, and it's very different right now. If we go by any of the standard indicators of science and research, it seems like China seems to have shot far ahead. In some niche areas, China now appears to be a world leader. If I want to give you an example, let's say the fabrication of samples in condensed matter physics. The same trend can be seen in higher education also, because some of the universities of China are well placed in world rankings in comparison to the educational institutes of India. So, and maybe this was not the case 25 years ago. Is this correct? And do you agree with what I just said? If so, what would you think accounts for this change in this trend? And what lessons can India learn from China, or the policymakers in India can learn from China?
Thank you. Thank you, Banya, for the question. And thank you again for the invitation to join you all this evening. So I'm a historian of the 20th century. Largely, my expertise lies in the middle decades of the 20th century. So already by the 70s and 80s, I feel a bit shaky. So I think whatever I say should be taken with a pinch of salt. That said, the collaboration that I led with my colleagues, were about 18 of us, nearly half historians of China, historians of India, and we worked together over 5 years. I can share some of the learnings that, from that project and what our observations were. And I've often discussed this with a colleague of mine, Arunabh Ghosh, who teaches Chinese history at Harvard, is that there is a larger story of 20th century developments in science and technology in China and India, which needs to be written, and it's not yet written, right? Like we do need, and Dhruv and Hari can add to this. We do need better archives to be able to write the story from this of the 70s and 80s, and we don't have those archives actually ready at hand. So whatever I say will be tentative, and it will be from observations from earlier decades and what we've learned, by interacting with people. So there was a divergence in the early, one can say broadly, there was a divergence in the early 20th century, which kind of came towards a conversion in the middle decades of the 20th century. But the divergence again that you're talking about, and there is one, there is no doubt about that, begins much earlier. It begins in the 70s already. Right. And 70s decisively. So it's not that, the divergence kind of gradually happens after the 70s. It decisively begins in the 70s. And a few things that one can actually point towards historically are as follows. So the 12-year science plan that the Chinese government embarked on. So remember, 47, 49, right? Like those are the years in which the modern nation states of China and India, in a sense, begin to participate in a global sort of model economy of science in a specific manner. That doesn't mean they weren't there before, obviously, but they begin in a specific manner in 47 and 49, respectively, for India and China. And the first Chinese 12-year plan comes already in 1956. And there are archival documents on the Chinese side which show us that the Indians actually wanted to look at the plan in 1956. Mm-hmm. They were not allowed to see the plan at that point of time. And the first science plan, so to speak, for India came as late as the 1970s with Mrs. Indira Gandhi. And that plan was shelved because the plan was, in fact, the implementation on the plan began during the emergency almost, and was shelved with the incoming new government and never taken up after Mrs. Gandhi came back to power again. So this is not to kind of place causality as the doorstep of a science plan, but this is to say that a concerted effort at integrating scientific research and education into larger questions began in a very, very decisive manner in the 50s in China. Remember, implementing a plan in 1956 would mean that a lot of thinking would have to happen before that. Yeah. Right? And so that began there, and it was a 12-year plan, not a 5-year plan. So the understanding that the horizon to change the landscape of research and its sort of concomitant relationships to other aspects of organizing education, for example, or patents, etc., was understood to be a far more long-term process than, say, a 5-year plan would allow. So in many ways, in the absence of proper archives to study this, in fact, also on the Chinese side, it's quite patchy. The archives are available, but it's patchy. Access is patchy. Mm-hmm. So what we can say is that you can say that in the mid-50s, the divergence has already begun, right? And the heavy investment in education, the heavy investment in laboratory research, in terms of funding, in terms of bringing back people, giving them research, and scholars such as Mark Walker have drawn a distinction for the Soviet Union, and I think one can tentatively extend that also for the Chinese case, which is a distinction between political freedom and scientific freedom, where you bring in people back from, so what are called return migrants, right? Like people who've gone to the United States to study, being brought back often actually under duress, maybe, or even under political pressure, but they are given the freedom in the lab to do a lot of things that, they might actually want to do. So in a sense, the interference is there, moderated more than the political freedom is moderated, right? And so one can say that those circumstances have allowed Chinese science, engineering, education, and research to develop in certain ways. Now, how does it exactly compare? So what we did, as historians, we still were focused very much up until the middle decades of the 20th century. So anything after that would have to be studied far more carefully. And I think it is studied at this moment by policy scholars so if the assumptions that policy scholars have are different to the assumptions that historians have, right? Like we begin with fewer assumptions. And in a sense, we don't set out to prove an observation, but rather actually set out to make an observation, right? And so I think that still needs to be done, but there's no doubt that there is a divergence, and that the roots of that divergence can be patchily traced back already to the mid 1950s. So that is sort of a slightly tentative answer to your question.
Thank you, Janvi. If I can just add a question to that, if I were to invite you to maybe point out at one or two things that may have happened in China during these years, from which we could take back a learning and we could implement similar structures or similar infrastructures in India for a better scientific development in the country. What would be your first one or two, three takes on that?
Yeah. So, again, I think Dhruv will bear me out on this. As historians, we look for specificity, right? And we seldom sort of draw very broad generalized lessons. That having said, I understand the nature of your question and where it's coming from. And what I would say is that I think what this calls for, without a doubt, is without doubt in my mind, is better investment in science research. Better investment in Indian universities. And this is something Dhruv has written about fairly early on, that, our universities are underfunded seriously. I mean, we have money being poured into national institutions of national importance, for example, or national laboratories, which are sort of the preferred form after the Second World War globally, but not to the detriment of Indian universities, to the detriment of universities elsewhere, but that has happened in India. So I think without a doubt, I can say that, say this much, that better organized funding for universities, a better sort of, organized funding agency structure, like the National Science Foundation, for example, or the Research Councils of the United Kingdom and other European agencies, etc. So independent bodies, peer-reviewed bodies, better organized, better peer-reviewed, etc. I think there is no doubt that needs to come in, and that needs to come in across the human, natural, and social sciences. It's not a question only of natural sciences and engineering. And I think that needs to come in without a doubt. I'm not saying this exists in China, but what I'm saying is that they did pour in money in a manner in which the political economy of China was served. And here, I think we would need to look at what would work for structures here, for people here, for the kind of existing infrastructure we have. And I think putting funding into universities is something that's long overdue. And IITs, sorry, the other thing. So like my favorite statement, and I think I'll repeat it until people ask me to shut up about it, is to pour as much money into the IITs as you pour into the IITs. And that's when we will see a difference in outcomes.
Thank you, Janvi. Dhruv, would you like to add something to that? You are on mute. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, no, I quite agree with, and I think I have quite a bit to say about the latter part. Yeah, I mean, China's commitment to developing their universities and their science and technology over the last 3 decades has left India far behind. There is no ground for comparison. As Janvi rightly pointed out, there was a common ground. Probably India was a little ahead in the 1950s, but I don't think there is a viable comparison any longer. We just need this. Okay. Yeah.
And that quite nicely brings me to the question for you, which is that even though science was relatively a very small scale affair in India in the early 1900s, it produced some very notable results. For instance, J.C. Bose's pioneering experiments on sensitivity of plants to external stimuli, or experiments with radio waves, the Shah equation, which were discovered in 1920, the Raman effect in 1928. All of these major developments had a global impact. And this trend also continued for some time after independence. But if we look at the last 50 years, in contrast, Indian science has become a much larger scale affair. If we talk about the infrastructure, the funding, but we do not, maybe we did not see such notable accomplishments of maybe global impact. Is this accurate? Is this an accurate observation? That's my first question. And if so, can you suggest an explanation or dissect the possible explanations for this trend that is being observed?
Thank you. I'm not sure, if I have a credible or a satisfactory explanation. But this whole way of looking back at the history of modern science in 20th century India is framed by a discourse of what I would call science and nationalism. And also by a trope, one might call the trope of the rise of science and the stagnation of science, in which there are heroic figures, and we announce their contribution to the advancing frontiers of knowledge, and then we have practitioners who carry on the tradition, or in Veblen's language, rantiyas, who live off the benefits of the tradition. They're so established. Yeah, but I would like to respond to it. As I said, I don't have a credible explanation, but I would like to respond to this at three levels. One, institutional, and the other two has to do with the imaginary we have of science and the role historians of science can play in changing that imaginary. So I want to tell, we need a story which is less about individuals, but more in terms of major institutional transformations in the world of science after the Second World War that changed the practice of science irreversibly. All right. And once that happened, the independent Indian nation state was drawn into playing what you might call catch up with me. All right, catch up with the West. You were drawn into that game. Now, I think Janvi has also hinted towards it, that though India was a model nation, it was in fact a model nation. I saw it when I visited the International Center for Theoretical Physics in the early 1990s. When you talk to people from other parts of the third world, they said, in India, you've accomplished a lot. So it was a model nation for the developing world in terms of its investment in the world of science. But however, with the wisdom of hindsight, one could argue that those investments were suboptimal to keep pace with the investments of the developed world, right, in the sciences during the Cold War. The Cold War was a great driver of investments in the sciences. So while the investments were substantial in developing world context, I don't study the economics of science, but I think the figures will bear me out. So while our investments were substantial, all right, they were not enough, to borrow a term from the 1950s, Bhabha and Saha used it, leapfrogging. They were not enough to catch up with the accelerated frontier of science in a global context. All right. The institutional transformation was so difficult. It was not like Rutherford doing experiments in nuclear physics in his lab with candle wax and string. It was another kind of science. All right. So that's the institutional backdrop we must keep in mind. And I think India's over the years has to do more and more work to keep abreast with the advancing frontier of science. Right. But from there, I'd like to move to another question. I mean, and that is, it's something historians of science have confronted, especially when you're talking about the post-1950s era. It becomes very difficult to write a national history of science. All right, because we have now lived through a century where the world of science has witnessed increased internationalization. So in addition to the people you named in your question, there are so many other people you could name, and then you wonder, where do you put them? Where would you situate somebody like ECG Sudarshan, for example? And the debate surrounding him is, here's somebody who's missed the Nobel Prize twice. Or where would you put the work of the statistician C.R. Rao? They did some of their work in India. They did much of their work abroad as well. I mean, where would you localize them? Where would you tell their stories? So there is the problem of the localization of the work of individuals and their institutional belonging in India, albeit they belong to very specialized niches of academic excellence, like the IFR or the Indian Institute of Science or whatever. All right. So these were the niches of excellence. So, I mean, where do we don't count them. They become kind of homeless individuals like this. All right. And so I think, in this list, we have a pantheon, and there are many, many people who are not part of the pantheon. So the pantheon looks rather thin. All right. So this pantheon has acquired a certain sanctity in the imagination of science. It starts with J.C. Bose, Acharya Prafulla Chandra Ray, one of my heroes. There's S.N. Bose, and we know that. But from the post-50s era, I mean, how many biographies, you tell me, how many good biographies have you seen of somebody like G.N. Ramachandran, who played such a phenomenal role? One of his PhD students was my colleague, and I often told her, she's now retired. I said, if you don't write the biography, who will? All right. Or how much work have we seen on, how much have we seen on except for some papers written on the subject in the 1970s, and one PhD thesis on the work of Shashi Shekharan and left-handed DNA. Mm-hmm. Right. Now, I don't want to give you an exhaustive list of people who are excluded, or an alternate list. All right. But what I'm trying to say is that those included in the pantheon have to be there. But we need to recognize that they were not the only ones. And when you do that, the question begins to change. Yeah. So it becomes ethically binding on the historian of science to look at the past of science with a finer lens. Yeah, I think I've gone on long enough, but I think there's one last point, which is a rather important point. That, most of the people in this pantheon have made contributions using an older vocabulary of science policy, have made contributions to the pure sciences. Most of the people included in the pantheon were physicists, even people like Sarabhai and others, all right, who lived through the golden age of physics. And because they lived in the old golden age of physics, we seem to neglect so many other fields. Right. But what about those who are working in, and I use the term parenthetically, I mean, who are working in the lesser sciences? Mm-hmm. Right, except for some papers by Abhasur, how much do we know about Anna Mani, a leading meteorologist? How much, one book on Janaki Ammal, and how much more do we know about her? So what happened to all our women scientists? Were they not there? Of course they were there. Have we talked about them? Do we put them in the pantheon? No. All right. And then in all of this, we never speak about the engineering sciences. All right. Looking at Hari's book, I mean, one can see that, there's a very important role for the engineering sciences there. Have we talked about it? Have we talked about those? Have we talked about the Nayodamas? Have we talked about the Satish Dhawans? I mean, we have talked about them in specialist journals, but they are somehow not part of the iconography or the imagination of modern science, of science in modern India. All right. And then, of course, what about agriculture? I remember in the 1980s when I came into the world of research, everybody was talking, oh, India is a developing country. 70% of the Indians live in the rural areas. Agriculture is so important. I mean, how much do anybody other than those working in agricultural science know of the work in agricultural science in India? Were there no heroes there? I find that deeply unlikely. Has anybody in the audience even heard of the names of D.L.N. Rao or Ratan Lal or any of these people? The point I'm trying to make is, yeah, we have posed the question. It is a question so often posed. I'm actually tired of the question. But the problem is not then, what I'm trying to suggest is the problem is not with Indian science.
Mm-hmm.
As it is with our conception of science, which is not capacious enough to look at science, which is pursued in so many other directions which we've not cared to look at. All right. I never thought actually, that I would be on a forum like today where I would end up defending Indian science. I never thought I would ever be doing that. But I think today, particularly in today's context, it merits far better treatment. Right? And the role of the history of science in revealing this context is probably one of the best steps forward in that direction. Yeah, I think that's all I really have to say, but I think these would be the three axes along which we could explore the problem.
Thank you. Thank you for I've been explaining the different phases of that discourse and that problem. And I would like to extend this question to both Hari and Janvi. How do you see that we can change this discourse, or we can change this notion that has made a place in our minds?
My answer is very quick. I second what Dhruv said, which is I think we need better histories, better narratives. We need to pay attention to what has happened. Mm-hmm. In all its, what's and all. But I think we need a better understanding of, as I think George Perkovich said that in the introduction to his book on the Indian bomb, which I used for, as a starting point also for my work, which is that what are the decisions taken in the past, and therefore what are the choices made, what are the consequences of those choices, and therefore where are we moving now, right? And in order to understand that, we need to, in a way, understand those decisions in their context, not to say that was wrong or that was right, but to say this was the rationale behind X choice, and the consequences and the costs of the decisions are X. And that would be a good way to move forward, right? So I think, the fact that, Dhruv and his colleagues have been struggling for decades to get a history of science program get going in an Indian university. We don't have a single university offering a degree program in history of science, history and philosophy of science, sociology of science. Of course, there are people in various departments, students of Dhruv and people like myself who've come back, after training elsewhere. But there is no concerted critical mass of scholars where we are training people properly in methods, in setting up archives. So there's no infrastructure to do this kind of work. And I think that would be a good starting place, really. A very, very essential place.
Thank you, Janvi. Hari, would you like to add to that?
I don't have much to say. I think both of them have said what needs to be said. And in any case, I'm not a historian. I'm a journalist. I just happen to write a book. So.
Yeah, but you have chronicled the scientists and their journeys, and how that have shaped the infrastructure of the Indian science enterprise in India. And that's a great piece of work. And because of this work that you have done, I think the next question that I wanted to ask you was that, what do you think about the role of institutions in the growth of Indian science? Because in your book, you have touched upon how the journey of specific scientists have led to the foundation of the Indian scientific enterprise and the institutions in India. So would you like to talk about the role of institutions?
Okay, so let me elaborate on that point, that I'm not a historian and I'm a journalist. And as a journalist, I'm interested in people. I'm interested in people as scientists, as individuals.
Yeah.
How they work, what are the problems that they face on a daily basis, and how do they solve them. I'm as much interested in their emotions as an individual as I am in the science that they did. Of course, I would like to see good archives, and I did try very hard. I couldn't get much. But then my book is constructed through interviews, and that's my primary source of information. Talking to people at great length. So if you look at the people that in the early days, like from Bhabha onwards, I have not met them. I have not read that much about it, but I have talked to people who worked with him. I've talked to his students, and sometimes for very, very long conversations. So whatever I know is from those conversations, not so much from going through archives. So in terms of about TIFR, what I have to say is, I think Bhabha wanted to set up an institution. First of all, he was not trying to set up a big institution. His main aim, as far as I understood, was to have an institution where he could work in the way he wanted. Indian Institute of Science had its own problems, and it was not doing the kind of research that he thought India should do. And he could not change the culture of the institute. It has already gone through a very turbulent phase. The first director itself had to resign, and then later C.V. Raman had a lot of problems. So it was a problem-ridden place. And in his opinion, it did not have the equipment or the culture to do modern physics that he wanted to do. So he thought he could set up an institution. He knew people, and they gave him money. And what he set up was sort of a model institution. And TIFR became a model because it had things that nobody else had, no other institutions had. It has a good place, a good office, centrally air-conditioned, good local, where people have all the freedom to do what they wanted. But it had only physics and mathematics initially, and then it grew. After that, there were some other institutions like NCL, and then later in biology, some certain departments which became sort of pioneers. But I don't think there is any TIFR after that, this kind of same scale. In terms of institutions become model institutions, I don't think there was anything else after that. CCMB and biology. That's all.
So if you look at these model institutions, if you in your experience of reporting about the science done at these institutions and the work taken up at these institutions, what is the major difference that you find between these model institutions that you just mentioned and the other scientific institutions in the country? What are some of the key lessons that you would say that can be learned and implemented from these model institutions?
So the first thing is, as what Chanvi said earlier, they have money, at least relatively speaking, because they had a charismatic person at the top. TIFR, it was Baba, and in CCMB, it was PM Bhargava, and in other places, and every one of these institutions, they had somebody who had some access to funds. So all these institutions had money, and if you have money, you could do things. And the lesser known institutions, there was nobody to bring the money. So this is a single most important difference. And of course, there were some cultural issues, like they had more freedom to work. They were more open place. But the most important thing, in my opinion, is money. Whatever I have seen is, so if you have access to funds, you could do more.
And while we look at the current scientific enterprise in the country, or the current trend of how science and research is done in the country, do you see a particular trend in these institutes or universities that could be particularly beneficial for the Indian science infrastructure?
I don't think I fully understood that question. Beneficial to Indian infrastructure? What did you mean?
I mean, any particular trend in that you see in these institutions, in these model institutions, or in the science culture in India right now, that could be helpful for the development of the scientific infrastructure in India? Apart from, of course, more funding and for research.
I think the most important thing is still money. But what has happened in the last 20 years, that is noticeable trend, is the rise of IISERs and IITs, especially IITs. IITs have the research output from IITs has substantially increased. And the quality of research from IIT is also significantly high. And they brought engineering to a level which was not in the, we had in India, the most visible aspect of Indian science was chemistry, through the for a few decades after independence. Biology started in the 70s, and then through the last 20 years, there was a lot of, but from 2000 onwards, IIT started publishing, and the rise of engineering as a research discipline is the most visible thing on Indian research that I have seen. And that has come from IITs. And IISER is also doing very well. Some of the IISERs are now giving a run for the money to the IISc, in terms of the research that they're doing.
Thank you, Hari. I think that I'll go back to the discussion that we had on archives that Janvi had picked up and also Dhruv had picked up. There are several scientific institutions in India today, and several of them have their own archives. Do you think that these institutions should also offer courses on history of science? And why is a course on history of science very important today in India? Your take on this. Janvi, would you like to respond to that?
So could you just quickly say what you were saying again, just the last bit?
Yeah, so do you think that these institutions with archives should introduce courses on the history of science? And why do you think that it's absolutely necessary now, maybe to have courses on history of science in India?
Yeah, so I don't think there is a necessary correlation between having an archive and having courses in history of science, right? I think archives are maintained by essentially, so what do we as historians of science study? We study the processes of knowledge production, right? The process by which science is done and how it's embedded deeply in society. And so the archives are spread all over, right? And the archives might not be necessarily institutional archives. They could be personal archives. They could be, in many other places. And so they needn't, so courses in history of science needn't necessarily be offered by those institutions. In fact, when history of science is a relatively young field, and I think Dhruv will be able to say much more to that than I can. But what I will say is that it did start out in this manner, that history of medicine was taught in medical schools, for example, and history of physics was taught in physics departments. Now, that's not to say that shouldn't be done. In fact, that should be done. But I think history of science is also a field in its own right now, and it has existed for a long enough time. And I think it needs to be allowed to prosper and thrive as an independent discipline with a critical distance from the practitioners of science. And therefore, the archive holding institutions are essentially materials from which we write our histories. We needn't write them in those institutions themselves.
Okay.
We could be at a distance. We should be, in fact, we should definitely be at a critical distance. We may or may not be in those institutions or not. But the infrastructure to be able to do that, right? To train new generations to be able to do that. And again, archiving is not something that historians do themselves, right? I mean, there are professionals who do archiving. And we as historians go and access those archives, right? And so there's the infrastructure. Those are two complementary, supplementary, essential things for each other, but they need to be grown separately. So there should be proper archival training. There should be proper collections policies. There should be proper sort of guidance on how to maintain those institutionally and otherwise. personal papers of people need to be acquired, etc. All of that. So that needs to continue. So so there are two professions here that we're talking about: that of the historians of science, engineering, medicine, environment, etc., etc., and archiving, right? So archivists and the supplementary things that go along with it. And it's essential, to do this, and just in a couple of sentences, because effectively we don't know why we are where we are, and if we don't understand that, any decision that's taken is in a way, we are unable to understand the archaeology of the layers upon which the present condition rests. And unless we're able to analyze that, any step forward is a blind step in many ways, right? So our assessment of our present is incomplete if we don't understand how we got there. And if we don't understand how we got there, then anything that goes ahead is going to be on equally shaky ground and very tenuous. In fact, decisions taken earlier probably were on less shaky ground than we are now. Because, I think historians of science, probably of a generation even earlier to Dhruw's, right, had colonial archives to rest on to understand in many ways the decisions, right? And so, and I mean, and this is not to say that history of science should feed only into policy. I mean, it's also about understanding, developing a critical public debate on science, for example, right? What is the public space of science? What is the public function of science? What is the place and space of science in Indian society, in Indian political economy? I think an understanding of that, or an informed public debate on that, can emerge only when we understand where these decisions are coming from. And, what are the consequences that we are living with of decisions taken in the past, be they about education, be they about research, be they simply about public discourse on science, right? And we know it is a highly contentious discourse. So I think history of science is as essential as history is, right? Like, it would be the same reason why bother with history, and we know why we should bother with history. And therefore, if science matters to us, then we need to know the history of science as well.
Dhruv, would you like to respond to that? And we have a very interesting question from our audience also, which is in a way connected to this discussion. During pandemic, I got to read a lot about history of science and got inspiration to be a scientist, and also understood how scientific investigation is done. Why isn't history of science in school curriculum today? I think you're on mute, Dhruv.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, I'd like to reiterate some of the points from a different angle that Janvi has made, and then come down to the question.
Yeah.
No, I mean, very specifically to the question, I think, yeah, institutes want to run courses in the history of science, they should run it. I don't see why not. Perhaps they should. But the salient question is, when you decide to run a course, what role do you envisage for the history of science? Why are you doing history of science? Is it celebratory and triumphalist, and to glorify your past? And I mean, and in that sense, it's not that it's unimportant, but, just like the question has come from the audiences now, yeah, people are inspired to do science when they read such works. Sure, it's important. But then we also want to understand the dynamics of the growth of scientific knowledge, the relationship or the place of science within culture, and the relationship of science in society. Science is part of culture, and science is transforming culture. All right. I mean, there were historians like Joseph Needham who said that, by enriching the memory of the past of science, we are also in a way contributing to the future of science. All right. In many parts of the world, in Germany, for example, history of science also contributes to science education. The construction of scientific experiments is then brought into school teaching of classical scientific experiments. So it has a role in didactics. All right. It has a role in the conceptual clarification of present ideas by turning to the past. Bertrand Russell, in his introduction to the history of the philosophy of mathematics, said that. All right. So if it is to be all of these and just not the first, that is the celebratory aspect of the history of science, if it is to be all these other things, then the identity of science, as Janvi was saying, cannot be parasitic about the scientific community. It has to have an agenda that goes beyond the scientific community. And this is something I've been arguing in from my papers from the early 1990s onwards, that the history of science must not be parasitic upon the sciences. It has to have a separate and an autonomous existence. Now, one of the features, I think, failures, Janvi rightly pointed out, of my generation of historians and philosophers of science and that preceding mind was our inability to remedy the weak institutionalization of the history of science in India. Or, only recently I was called to give an inaugural talk at the creation of a department of the history and philosophy of science created by philosophers. In the Center for Philosophy, you created a space for the history and philosophy of science. So we know where the focus of investigation will be. But it is important to note that the historiographic revolution in the history of science, which my generation was sort of born into, we grew up, inspired by that in the history of science in the 1980s, was informed by developments in what you call social theory and philosophy, which was at the conjuncture of anthropology, sociology, gender studies, anti-race studies, transcultural history, history of ideas, all right? Philology, because we're not just studying the present of science, we are studying the very ancient past of science, we are studying the medieval history, we are studying all these periods, right? In a science institute, your focus could be, a research institute of science could be the present of science and the present of the people who are at your institute. All right, and these developments in the history of science then goes on to transform even social theory. It alters sociology, it alters history. See, for example, Zoe Todd's recent work on indigenous knowledge, for example. Now, so I think, therefore, the natural home for the history of science is the university. And I'm in total agreement with Janvi. I believe that. But I think that the IITs have attempted in some way, they have tried in some way, to capture the flavor of what we call the humanities and social sciences, and to the extent possible, nurture history of science within the IITs, to the extent possible. The IISERs are trying them in their own way. But getting back to the research institute, so for example, a legendary historian of physics, Spencer Weird, was a historian of science associated with the American Institute of Physics. All right. And the richness of his contribution, you can see, is a reflection of his widespread and expansive training in this interdisciplinary field, which is the history of science. He wasn't trained at a research institute, right? History of science is an interdisciplinary field. So the answer to the question is, what do you want to do with the history of science? And today, I think, for example, we entertain the possibility of the history of sciences enabling a dialogue between the sciences and the social sciences, of disclosing conceptual linkages between the sciences and the social sciences. All right. A lot of this work is long-winded, time-consuming. The scales which only a university can allow for, not a research institute. All right. But then, I'm going to get into my favorite hobby horse, like the importance of history and philosophy of science there, but no, I'll stop here. Yeah.
Thank you, Dhruv. We have a very interesting question coming up for Hari.
Just one sec. So the question is that school textbooks do it badly, but they do try to address the history of sciences in little blocks on the history of science inserted in the text. They recognize its importance. It's not done well enough. Yeah.
Yes. So coming back to the question for Hari. So what inspired you to write Space Life Matter? Why did you decide to look at the Indian science and bring those experiences in the form of a book?
So let me add. It's related to what I wanted to say about what both of them said. Apart from academic study of history, and what interests me is I read a lot of popular history. I don't read academic history, and I'm not an academic historian. Sometimes I do read, and unfortunately, we haven't had popular history in science in India. So especially scientific biographies. So Dhruv mentioned that there should be a history of a biography of GNR. So there are at least 4 or 5 scientists in India who've done enough to merit a good biography, which is also a bestseller. But far from being a bestseller, it has not even been written, So why is that? I think it's partly because books don't sell that much in India, and it's very hard to make a living writing books. Professional writers need to sell books to make a living, and only then will they have the time and the money to invest in a project. To write a good biography, it takes 2 to 3 years, and unless you get at least some return on that investment, not the full thing, at least, or at least you have the satisfaction of people having bought the book and read it in enough numbers, you don't get inspired to write such books. But I think as the market develops, we should see such books more. Now, coming to what inspired me, it was just a very, very accidental thing. Somebody asked me, whether I have a book idea. I said yes. I couldn't say no. I had been thinking about this for at least 10 years now, but I had not written anything. And then I wrote a proposal, sent it to the agent, and I got offers. And I really started thinking about the book only after I signed the contract. And it took me a year to figure out what I should write. I only knew that I wanted to write about this period, something about these people. So that's how the book happened. And looking back, at least the final part of the book has been done in a hurry, because the COVID, by that time COVID had started, and the book was sort of an unfinished thing in many ways in my mind. So there is no inspiration as such that I can think of, except some individuals, but that would not have resulted in a book. I signed a contract, so I wrote a book. That's it.
Thank you, Hari. Both Dhruv and Janvi are also authors here. And I would also like to extend this question to them. What inspires you when you think about writing a book? How do you go about it?
You want me to answer that? No, inspired. I don't know. I don't like thinking in terms of epiphanies. All right, but yeah. But despite that, I think there's an interesting problem. One is my writing has been fragmentary. A problem interests me. I write a research paper. At the end of some time, I think, all right, I've written up 10 papers on this. I put it together as a book. That's the way I write a book. All right. I don't write, I choose a problem. No, there are little fragmentary problems that I look into. I'm that kind of a researcher. Right. And then I put it into, when I begin to see that a theme has been built around the little fragmentary problems I've addressed. But there are people who have a book on a subject in mind. All right. Like you want to do a history of physics. I don't work like that. I'm interested in small, little problems, and I see them building up into something bigger at the end of it. And then I cobble it together. Okay. That's all. I don't have an epiphany.
That's a very interesting process. Janvi, would you like to add?
Yeah, so I haven't written as much as Dhruv has. I have one monograph, and I have a couple of edited books, and then a few papers. Why do I write, or when I have written, why have I written? There are questions that nag at you, right? Like, what is this? And so my first book, which in fact came out entirely from my doctoral thesis or doctoral research, was when, I was sitting in 20th century history of science classes, Cold War history of science classes, and I would be like, okay, what was happening in India? Why don't I know anything about it? Why, so it was like, okay, the most interesting middle decades of the 20th century question is about experimental nuclear physics. And I was like, okay, what were the Indians doing? Right. And so I wanted to chase those labs and find out what they were doing. Right. And I wasn't interested in the bomb. I was interested in experimental nuclear physics, because that in a way would make anything possible, right? So the bomb itself was uninteresting also because there's no archive to write, no proper archive to write from. And so for me, it's questions. So the India-China project also grew out of that question, right? Like, it's like, okay, we've talked about India and China together so much. And those were, the last decade was when, again, we were talking about it a lot. So it's like, okay, what are those stories and how do we compare, right? And so basically, a colleague of mine and I put together a group of, about 18 of us, half working on India, half of us working on China. And the experiment was to write those papers together. So for example, the paper that I wrote was about the first Indian plan, which I spoke about, and my colleague wrote about the first Chinese plan. And the volume, of course, covers several areas, the tiger project, the snow leopard project, the panda project, whatnot, and coal and this and that. So range of questions then, that we considered. So again, that question was, okay, so why, when we're talking so much about India and China, how do they compare, right? In history of science, but the interest was not so much policy. The interest really was in history of science. So things like that, right? And I'm numbers, for example, Dhruv already spoke about C.R. Rao. Where do you place C.R. Rao in the story, or where do you even place Mahalanobis in that story, right? Mahalanobis is known for his work on the Planning Commission, the National Sample Survey, but in the 50s, for example, India was at the forefront of sampling technologies, thinking statistically about the problem of scale, right? Which both India and China confronted, and they are addressed very differently. So for me, the starting points are questions, and although I've come around now because I'm in a very different situation, I'm not in a full-time academic job as I was until 4 years ago. And so now I don't have as much time to, pull things together. So I think I'm moving more towards how Dhruv works, which is to think of, writing maybe smaller papers and then seeing how they might come together. But I do think monographs. They're not epiphanic in any way. I absolutely do not know the answers before I start, like most of us historians don't. But I even when I thought about the History of Statistics project, I could actually see the chapters. Or when I was working on the aeronautics project, I could see the chapters. I decided not to write that book eventually, and I've written one paper. I'm probably going to write another one and then finish it off. But yeah, so it's often questions that bother you. It's like, okay, how, why, yeah.
Thank you, Janvi. We have questions pouring in from the audience, but unfortunately, Shruti has just given me 3 minutes to close. So we'll just be taking concluding remarks from all of you. And Hari, just your concluding message, your concluding remark for our audience.
I hope people buy science books and read. And I hope people write good biographies of Indian scientists. You have a model here, The Man Who Knew Infinity by Robert Canigal and Ramanujan. We should have biographies of a similar quality on C.V. Raman, on GNR, on J.C. Bose, S.N. Bose, and all those people. I think that is my wish.
Absolutely. I second that. Dhruv, your concluding remarks for our audience?
Yeah, no, the pursuit of science is very exciting. The pursuit, I'm not sure that we can learn lessons from the history of science about the past, in the sense that as science goes, we are also altering our future. So we don't know how much we can predict and how much we can learn. But just the growth of science is so exciting. But also how science changes society is so important, and is so important. And I think telling that story requires a whole new set of skills, and also requires a vision of a connected world. And today, I think when we look as historians of science, we need to tell stories of how the world is connected, all right, and how ideas are connected. That's the story we need to tell. Yeah.
Wonderful. I don't think I can top that. I think that was fabulous. I think that message needs to be reiterated for all sorts of reasons. The connected nature of our world, and why thinking about these stories might matter, actually. So just a small footnote to that, which that message needs to be reiterated. Small footnote to that, to say something again that Dhruv said earlier, which is understanding science in context, science in culture, science as part of culture, and science as transforming of culture. And therefore, the need for a very strong dialogue between the human, social, and natural sciences, and of course, engineering sciences, I'm just kind of bucketing them together, is very, very critical. It's absolutely critical today. And I think that that needs to happen. That opening needs to happen in order not only for us to write better histories of science, but also to realize the message that Dhruv just gave, which is the connected nature of what it is. And I think we bring different tools when we come from the humanities and social sciences to the situation. And I think in school, we used to have this exercise called critical appreciation. And I think we forget that. We forget that very quickly after we leave school. And critical appreciation means you appreciate with a critical eye. And I think that critical appreciation of science needs to be inculcated as a skill, as a mental skill, as an intellectual skill in students of no matter what discipline. It really doesn't matter what discipline, what profession you practice, but you need a critical appreciation. Like you need like you need that for art, like you need that for, and I include music in that. You also need that for science in the public domain.
Thank you, Janvi. With that, I thank our panelists, Janvi, Dhruv, and Hari, for joining us today. I feel we have just been able to scratch the surface of this discussion today, history of science, which is a fascinating journey from the past towards shaping the future. I hope that these conversations will continue and we will meet again at another table. I thank you once again for spending your evening with us. I thank everyone for tuning in and spending your Sunday time with us. With that, I take your leave and I hand it over to Shruti.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Banya. Thank you, Dr. Falke, Professor Rena, and Hari sir for joining us. It was an absolute pleasure listening to this conversation. And I can imagine it was really beneficial for our attendees too. And with that, I will invite our next speaker to join in and request the panelists of the previous session to kindly switch off their videos. Thank you so much. I'd just like to take a moment to thank all of our partners for having been associated across the course of the festival, all of our program partners, our knowledge partners, outreach partners. Thank you for being associated with us and supporting us through the course of this journey. Special mention to our backend moderators, Parth, Rupsi, and Shubh, who have been moderating the session backend and also providing all the updates on social media. With that, I'd like to extend a very, very warm welcome to Professor Anil Seth, who's joined us on this wonderful Sunday evening. Professor Seth, thank you so much for joining in. A very small introduction would be that Professor Seth is the Cognitive and Computational Neuroscience Professor at the University of Sussex, and he's also the co-director of the Sackler Center for Consciousness Science. He's the co-director of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research Program on Brain, Mind, and Consciousness, and is also the editor-in-chief of Neuroscience of Consciousness at the Oxford University Press. It is an absolute pleasure to host you, Professor Seth, at the India Science Festival. This is a topic that our attendees are very, very curious to know about. And this is the first time at the festival that we have introduced a series of book talks. And we're very curious to know about your latest book, Being You, A New Science of Consciousness. And I can see it in the back behind you. And our attendees are, of course, very, very curious to know about the book. And we've dropped a link of the book in the chat, so make sure to check it out at the end of this session. Professor Seth will be delivering a talk and we'll take questions from the audience towards the end, and I will myself relay them to you, Professor. And yeah, we request all our attendees to drop in their questions in the Q&A tab, and I will also encourage all of you to tell us what you thought about this session and tag us on social media so that the best tweets win exciting prizes. Professor Seth, over to you.
Thank you very much, Shruti. That's very, very kind indeed. I'm just going to do the the screen share dance. Just forgive me for a second. And this should work, hopefully. So I'm assuming you can see my first slide, which is just all the details again. Yeah, great. Yes. Well, thank you for the invitation. It's really a great pleasure to speak to you today at the India Science Festival. I think you can tell from my it's always a delight to hear my name pronounced properly when being introduced. It doesn't happen very often at meetings. In fact, I can't do it myself because although my family is well, I'm half Indian. majority of my family come from Allahabad in UP, but I was born and brought up in the UK. So unfortunately, I don't speak Hindi or any other Indian language, but it's definitely a big part of my heritage. And I always enjoyed talking to Indian audiences about my work, about consciousness, because I think there's a very interesting dialogue to be had here. I also just need to apologize briefly. I'm still recovering from COVID. As you know, the UK has done a horrendous job of managing COVID over the last year. And so I'm a little bit short of voice. So I will do my best, but I'm not exactly firing on all cylinders, but I will try. Okay. So with that, this is going to be a general half-hour little talk about consciousness. And it gives an overview of some, but not by no means all of the themes that I discuss in this new book. And the book is really it's the fruits of about the last 20, 25 years that I've spent working on the neuroscience, the biology of consciousness, both in the UK and in the US. So I think we need to start, as always, with a definition. When we talk about consciousness, what exactly are we talking about? Well, I think the definition is very simple. And we're not going to come up with a consensus definition that everybody automatically agrees with. But what I want to do is give an intuitive definition, just so we don't talk past each other, that we can start off at least on the same page. And for me, consciousness is any kind of subjective experience whatsoever. It's not the same as intelligence. It's not the same as language. It's not the same as the experience of being a self. It's any experience, whether it's pain, pleasure, a thought, an emotion, and feeling of intention. These are all aspects of consciousness. Now, a little bit more formally, I always prefer to start with the definition of the philosopher Thomas Nagel. We were just hearing about the philosophy of science in India. Thomas Nagel was a great philosopher and historian of science too. And his definition of consciousness, which goes back to the 1970s, is that an organism has conscious mental states if and only if there is something it is like to be that organism. If it feels like something to be that organism, it feels like something to be me, it feels like something to be each one of you. It probably feels like something to be a bat. As Thomas Nagel's famous paper said, for those of you who know it, what is it like to be a bat? We humans don't know, we can't experience the inner universe of a bat, but for the bat, it feels like something to be that bat. And the same for probably many other animals too. But there is probably nothing it feels like to be a stapler or a table or even an iPhone. It's a mechanism, a complex mechanism, but it doesn't feel like anything to be that complex mechanism. That's the broadest definition of consciousness. Now, this raises the question of how do we begin to understand consciousness within our wider picture of the natural world. And our wider picture of the natural world, at least in Western science and philosophy, tends to be materialistic, tends to be physicalist, tends to be in terms of some description of matter and the interactions among whatever matter ultimately is. And so how do these interactions give rise to or in some way become identical with consciousness is one of these outstanding problems in science and philosophy that's been with us in different guises and in different cultures for thousands of years. And it's probably most best crystallized, or certainly the best known crystallization of this problem is by David Chalmers, the philosopher who took this problem, which has been articulated by René Descartes, by all sorts of people, and put it in terms of the hard problem of consciousness. Here is what he says. He says, this is in the 90s, it is widely agreed that experience arises from a physical basis, but we have no good explanation of why and how it so arises. Why should physical processing give rise to a rich inner life at all? It seems objectively unreasonable that it should, and yet it does. So Chalmers contrasts this hard problem with the easy problems of neuroscience, of consciousness. And the easy problems basically are all the problems that neuroscience or any science can tackle that need not make any reference to consciousness at all. How the brain as a mechanism implements all the functions and underlies all the behaviors that it does, how it transforms sensory input into muscle contractions and outputs and things like that. These, of course, are not easy problems. They're very, very challenging problems. But the intuition is there's no conceptual mystery that functions and behaviors can in principle be explained by complex mechanisms. That's the normal business of science and engineering. And Chalmers' intuition is that even after you've solved all these easy problems, at the end of neuroscience, this hard problem will remain pristine, untouched, as mysterious as it seems today. And this gives rise, this sort of motivates this idea of dualism, that the physical universe and the universe of consciousness are two different modes, and the challenge is then how they interact. That's one way to think about this. Of course, thinking of this mystery in this very black and white sense gives rise to a bunch of other potential responses. One that's becoming increasingly popular, at least in like, well, if not academically, it's certainly getting a lot more air these days, is this idea of panpsychism, that consciousness is somehow fundamental and ubiquitous. It's somehow in everything and everywhere. Now, this obviates the hard problem, because if consciousness is built into the fabric of the universe from the ground up, well, you don't need to explain how it comes to be. So it's consistent. The issue, or at least my issue with panpsychism, is not so much that it seems crazy, it's just that it doesn't explain anything, it can't be tested, and it doesn't generate any testable hypotheses. So it's a bit of a lame answer to, I think, this mystery that we all face about trying to understand what consciousness is like and why it's there. Now, another extreme, and this is again a position articulated by a number of philosophers like Keith Frankish, Daniel Dennett, Michael Graziano, is that we're just mistaken if we think there's anything particularly special or significant about the consciousness as a scientific and philosophical problem. Illusionism is the position that consciousness doesn't really exist, at least not how we normally think of it. Now, I have a bit more sympathy for this position, but I think of it as a bit like a powerful medicine. If you take just the right amount, it's very helpful because it can undercut some of our naive intuitions about what we're trying to explain when we're trying to explain consciousness. An example of such a naive intuition would be that the conscious self is the recipient of conscious experiences rather than part of consciousness. And we'll come to that later. But if you take too much of this illusionist medicine, I think you get into trouble, because then you start denying the central phenomenon that we're trying to explain, that conscious experiences are real, that they exist, that there is something it is like to be a conscious creature. So that's illusionism. So I find it just useful to know, just to stake out the territory. But the approach I take is neither of these really, although illusionists sometimes claim that it is. It's called the real problem of consciousness, not the hard problem and not the easy problem. And the real problem of consciousness, this is the approach I just explore in the book, is to ask a slightly different question. It's to ask, how can mechanisms and processes in the brain and the body explain, predict, and control properties of consciousness, both functional, like what can we do in virtue of being conscious, and critically, phenomenological. Why is a visual experience the way it is and different from, let's say, an olfactory experience or an emotional experience? What about what happens in brains and bodies that explains the qualitative, phenomenal character of different kinds of experiences? That's the real problem. Now, this is neither the hard problem nor the easy problem. It's not the hard problem because we're not trying to say how and why consciousness is part of the universe in the first place. It's also not the easy problem because we're not sweeping the mystery of consciousness away under the carpet and pretending it doesn't exist. It's certainly not a new approach. It inherits from a number of traditions. The tradition that I think is closest is often called neurophenomenology, pioneered by people like Francesco Varela, Evan Thompson, and so on, which is again this idea of understanding phenomenological properties in terms of neural mechanisms. Now, if we do this, and I'm going to give you some examples of what this looks like in practice, then I do think we stand a chance of coming up with a satisfactory science of consciousness. But instead of solving the hard problem of David Chalmers head on, I think we'll achieve this through dissolving it. And there's a precedent to thinking this way. And the main precedent for me is how we came to a modern understanding of life. It was not that long ago, again in Western scientific circles, that life was considered to be beyond the remit of physics and chemistry, that there had to be some spark of life, some special source, some élan vital that explained the difference between the living and the non-living. This was the philosophy of vitalism, which was very prominent in the late 19th through a surprising chunk of the 20th century. But of course, as biologists got on with the job of explaining the properties of living systems like metabolism and reproduction, so on, in terms of physics and chemistry, then this hard problem of life seemed little by little less mysterious, and eventually it dissolved. It wasn't solved. It wasn't like people found the spark of life or proved that life didn't exist. It's just that the need to appeal to that sense of there being one big scary mystery faded away as we understood more about how to explain properties in terms of mechanisms. And I think the same strategy is helping us and will help us understand consciousness. Now, I don't want to overdo this parallel. It's obviously consciousness and life are not the same thing. One of the methodologically, the big difference between trying to understand a living system and trying to understand consciousness is that you can put a living system on a table or on a lab bench and all look at it and all agree about what the data are. You can agree about what's going on. But a conscious experience is intrinsically private and subjective. I can describe my conscious experiences, but that's not the same as you having direct access to what I'm experiencing. You cannot put a conscious experience on the table and look at it in the same way you can put a frog on a table and look at it. But this doesn't mean that a science of consciousness is impossible. No, it just means the relevant data are harder to collect, and that's a challenge, but it shouldn't undermine this approach. Okay, so if we take this approach, next comes the question of, well, if we're not going to treat consciousness as one big scary mystery, how do we treat it? How do we divvy it up into different properties? And there are many ways to do this. My preferred way is in terms of three basic features of consciousness: conscious level, how conscious you are. This is broadly the difference between being in a dreamless sleep or under anesthesia and being awake and aware, as we all are now. Conscious content: when you are conscious, you're conscious of something. The people, places, and objects that populate are conscious seen at any one time. And then there's conscious self, the experience of being an individual in the world, of being you. Now, I'm not going to talk about level today, but I'm going to talk about content and a little bit about self in the 15 minutes I have left. So there's one animating idea that I think is very useful to understand why our experiences of the world and of the self are the way they are. And this is the idea that the brain is a prediction machine, and that what we see, hear, and feel are nothing other than the brain's best guesses about the causes of its sensory inputs. Now, this is, again, not a new idea. Its roots can be traced back in philosophy as far as you want to go, at least as far as Plato, for instance, and this allegory of the cave of Plato, where the shadows cast by firelight on the walls of this cave are treated as the real world by the prisoners within, because that's all they know. Updating that allegory to the 21st century, the 20th century, we come up with this idea of perception as inference. And understand this, just change perspective for a bit and imagine that you are your brain. And there you are, you're stuck inside a bony skull, trying to figure out what's out there in the world. Now, there's no light in the skull, there's no sound. All you've got to go on as a brain are streams of electrical signals, which are only indirectly related to what's out there in the world, whatever that might be. So perception, this process of figuring out what's there, has to be a process of informed guesswork in which ambiguous sensory signals are combined with the brain's prior expectations or beliefs about the way the world is to form the brain's best guess of the causes of these signals. The brain doesn't see light or hear sound. What we perceive is the brain's best guess of what's out there. Let me give you a couple of examples to show at least how this works a little bit in practice. And you may have seen this illusion before. I can't see any faces, but maybe you'll have seen this before. This is Adelson's checkerboard. And in this illusion, there are two patches, A and B, and hopefully they look to be different shades of gray, with B looking lighter. Now, it's an illusion. Of course, they're exactly the same shade of gray. And I can show you that if I just put another version up with the two patches joined together. And you can see it's one continuous shade of gray. Just to show I'm not messing around, I can move that bar across and you can see now it really is a single continuous shade of gray. But take it away and they look different again. So what's happening here? Well, what's happening here is that the brain is using its prior knowledge encoded into the circuitry of the visual cortex, knowledge that you may not be aware that your brain has, that objects under shadow appear darker than they are. And so we see the patch B as lighter than it really is. And this underlines the point that vision isn't supposed to be a camera. It's not supposed to sort of be a light meter. It's supposed to infer what's out there in the world on the basis of ambiguous data. So we see B as lighter than it really is. Now that's one example of the general problem of perception. And this is the only equation I'm going to show in this talk, and it's Bayes' theorem. And Bayes' theorem is it provides a framework for understanding what the brain is doing when it's doing this kind of predictive perception. And what it's doing is it's taking what it knows, believes now, the so-called prior. You can see that, that's the curve, the dotted or short dash line. And Bayes' theorem tells us mathematically how to update a prior belief on the basis of new data. And the new data here is the likelihood to come up with an updated belief, which is the posterior. It's basically going from what we already believe to what we should believe, given some new information when everything is laden with a certain amount of uncertainty. That's what Bayesian inference is all about. And that's, at least at one very high level, that's what the brain has to do when it's trying to interpret the causes of the sensory signals that impinge on its eyes, ears, and so on. Now, fast forward again to the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, we have Hermann von Helmholtz, who was probably the first person to suggest directly that what the brain is doing in perception is a kind of unconscious inference. We're not conscious of this process. We didn't know that our brain knew about how objects behave under shadow. We're only conscious of the outcome of that process. We see the patches being different shades of gray. So Helmholtz talked about perception as a process of unconscious inference. And now we think about this in terms of actual neural circuits and mechanisms. This is one such circuit mechanism story, which is called predictive processing. This is something I've been very interested in for a number of years, nearly 10, well, 15 years now. And this is a way by which the brain can actually achieve or implement Bayesian inference or approximate it. And the idea is that what's happening in the brain is that connections that come from the inside out or the top down are continually conveying predictions about the causes of sensory signals. And then the sensory signals, the stuff that flows from the world into the brain, is just conveying the difference between what the brain expects and what it gets at every level of processing. It's conveying the prediction errors. And the idea is that by minimizing, by updating predictions to minimize prediction errors everywhere and all the time, the brain's predictions will settle on this Bayesian posterior, this best guess of what's out there. And the hypothesis is that that is what we consciously perceive, this continually evolving brain-based best guess that is calibrated by sensory data from the world. Now, this is a really different way to think about perception. It's so easy to think, for us to think of perception as this process of reading out the world from the outside in or the bottom up, as if the world just pours itself into our minds through the transparent windows of our ears and our eyes and our other senses. This is the sort of naive classical straw man view of perception as a bottom-up process of feature extraction from data as it streams into the perceptual cortices. This is the visual cortex of a monkey, and early areas might respond to things like edges and lines, and then later deeper areas to more complex features like faces and objects. In dramatic contrast to that view, predictive processing suggests that perceptual content is not conveyed by reading out these sensory signals in an inside-out, in an outside-in direction, but is conveyed by top-down predictions. The bottom-up sensory signals convey just the prediction errors, the difference between what we get, what we expect and what we get. So perception is always in the process of active generation, not a passive registration of what happens to be out there. Okay. Now, you might think I've diverted a little bit from the core question of consciousness, but what I'm trying to provide is a language in which we can think about why conscious experiences are the way they are. So predictive processing itself is not a theory of consciousness in the sense of like it's telling you the sufficient ingredients for a system to be conscious. It's a general theory of perception and action and cognition and so on that can be used to explain properties of what experiences are like in terms of their underlying mechanisms, exactly in the style of the real problem that I just mentioned. Now, let me give you a couple of examples. If something like this is on the right track, it would suggest that we should consciously perceive what the brain expects more accurately and more quickly than what is not expected. And we tested this idea in an experiment many years ago now with my postdoc at the time, Yaya Pinto. And we used a method called continuous flash suppression, where we expose different images to the different eyes. So one eye sees an image of a face or a house, which gradually increases in contrast. And the other eye sees a changing pattern of colored blobs, which gradually decreases in contrast. And what the person sees is firstly just the blobs because they're high contrast. And at some point, the image breaks through into conscious perception, and the person just has to press house or face when they see the relevant image. And what we also did, and you can see this here too, is that we cued people to expect a face or a house. And sometimes the cue was valid and sometimes it was not valid. And what we found was when the cue was valid, that's when the sensory data matched the prediction, the expectation, people indeed responded more accurately and more quickly. So people see what they expect rather than what they don't expect, at least in this one experiment. Now, we can use the same idea to think about unusual forms of perception, perhaps when perceptual predictions overwhelm sensory data. We're used to this in everyday life when we see things like faces and clouds. This is an example of the general phenomenon of pareidolia, seeing patterns in things. We can see faces in clouds, we can see faces in the windows of churches, and so on and so on. The idea being that the brain has a very strong predictions to see faces. Faces are very salient, so we tend to perceive faces even when faces don't exist. So what we've been doing in my research group at Sussex is taking this idea a little bit further and trying to build computational models of different kinds of visual, unusual visual experience, a method called computational phenomenology or computational neurophenomenology. Now, the first example of this, we used a standard deep learning neural network, which is very good at classifying what objects are in images, but we ran it backwards. This is using an adaptation of an algorithm called Google's Deep Dream. And when we did this and did this to a panoramic movie that people watched through a VR headset, we get something like this. And so there are a lot of dogs in this image. What's happening is the network is projecting predictions of dog into this panoramic video at every level of granularity. It's not just photoshopping dog pictures onto each frame. They're emerging from the image in a weird way. And what's critical here is that this isn't a computational model of a function or of a behavior. It's a computational model of what an experience is like. I think that shows the power of this approach to try to understand the nature of our conscious experiences. Now, we're taking this a lot further at the moment with my colleagues Keisuke Suzuki and David Schwartzman and Alec Chance, using a bit more complicated neural network models with generative and discriminative components to try to simulate different kinds of visual hallucination here. And I'll just give you a taste for this. So what we do by parameterizing this network in different ways, we take all of these input images and we end up with different kinds of simulated hallucination of the sort that people get when they have Parkinson's disease or dementia or Charles-Bonnet syndrome, when they lose their central vision, as well as different kinds of psychedelic experience. So we're now actually able to model different kinds of visual hallucination. And then we're going back to people who have these different conditions and asking them to pick from our model what is most representative of their own actual lived experience. So we kind of close the loop on this computational phenomenological approach. And the idea is this gives us a handle on understanding the computational basis of altered perception. And by doing that, we understand more about normal perception too. So the take home from this is that hallucination of the sort that we've just seen can be thought of as a kind of uncontrolled perception where the brain's best guesses are not well controlled by sensory signals. But that normal perception in the here and now all the time is also a kind of hallucination, but a controlled hallucination in which the brain's predictions are reined in by sensory signals coming from the world, controlled by these sensory signals in ways that are not determined by their accuracy, but by their utility for the organism. And the larger claim here is that this applies to everything. It applies to not just faces or dogs, but to all the aspects of our experience of the world and of the self. There are all kinds of different kinds of perceptual best guesses. Now, I want to finish by saying that this applies also to the self, to the experience of being a self. And this gets at another intuition I think we need to undercut. And this intuition is that there's a world which is perceived by the self. The self is somehow inside the brain and body, perceiving the world and then acting upon it. We sense, we think, we act. That's how things seem. But how things are is a bit different, I think. That both experiences of the world and of the self are kinds of perceptual prediction. The self is not the thing that does the perceiving. The self is a perception too. And it's created in the same way. It's created by a process of brain-based best guessing. And there are many ways in which we experience being a self. I'll just focus on one of them, which is the experience of this object in the world that is my body, the experience of embodiment. It's a core part of what it means to be me. And there's two parts of this too. One of them is this experience of just having a body, this object in the world that is the body. And the brain is continually inferring what parts of the world are its body and what aren't. And we can see disruptions of this in things like the rubber hand illusion and things like phantom limb syndrome and so on. But there's also a very basic experience of being a body, of being an embodied living organism, associated with moods, with emotions. And at its core, what I propose is just this basic sense of being alive, the feeling of being alive. I think is the core to all our experiences of self and of consciousness in general. Now, this experience of being a body of emotion and mood brings up this interesting field of interoception, not introspection, but interoception. And we normally think of sensation and perception as pertaining to the outside world: smell, taste, touch, hearing, vision. But a large territory in the brain, a large amount of neural resource is dedicated to perceiving and controlling sensory signals that come from inside the body. This is interoception, sensation and perception of the physiological interior of the body. These interoceptive sensory signals communicate to the brain things like blood pressure and heart rate and gastric tension and blood oxygenation and all these sorts of things. And this is critical because if you think about it, the primary point of having a brain is not to do science or philosophy or even language. It's to keep the body alive. It's to stay alive. That's what brains are fundamentally for. Now, interoception, even though the brain is dealing with signals that come from inside the body, it still has no direct access to what their causes in the body are. So an idea I've been proposing for many years is that interoception still has to work by this same basic principle of prediction and prediction error. The brain makes a best guess about causes of signals from inside the body, and that's updates it with prediction errors, and that's what we perceive when we experience things like emotion and mood and embodied selfhood. And there's a critical aspect to this, which I think I want to emphasize, which is that interoceptive predictions are about controlling things rather than finding things out. Like in vision, for instance, typically the brain wants to figure out what's there. Is it coming towards me or away from me? Is it likely to hurt? Should I eat it? Should I catch it? Should I avoid it? Interoceptive predictions about the interior of the body, they don't care where the kidneys are, where the lungs are, what shape anything is. They care about how well regulation of the internal physiology is going, how good a job the brain is doing of keeping the body alive. And predictions can be used for control. In fact, this is another, I don't have time to talk about today, but huge motivation for this view is that this prediction error cycle is an extremely good way of implementing control, of keeping essential physiological quantities like blood pressure and heart rate and so on, where they need to be in order to stay alive. But it also explains, and this is what I do want to mention in closing, that why different experiences are the way they are. So visual predictions underpin visual perceptual experiences. The brain cares about what's there. We see objects with spaces in between. Things have a character of spatiality and distances and so on. But interoceptive predictions underpin embodied experience. Interoceptive predictions are all about control and regulation. So we experience emotions, not in terms of things in different places, but in terms of valence, in terms of how well or badly things are going. So this exemplifies this real problem approach. We can start to understand the differences between different kinds of experiences in terms of different kinds of predictions. So let me wrap up. What I've tried to explain today is that what we consciously see depends on the brain's best guesses of the causes of sensory signals. This applies to our experiences of things in the world, but it also applies to experiences of being a self, of, for instance, the body as an object in the world, but also of just the experience of being a body, of being a living organism. And these deep-rooted embodied experiences have more to do with control and regulation than with what's there. Now, in the book, I make the case that this is actually the fundamental role of a brain is to keep the body alive, so we can understand the origin of all perceptual experiences now in terms of their roots in evolution and development and in the day-to-day operation in regulating the body, in life itself. So this brings consciousness much closer to life than to other things like intelligence and so on. And it provides a nice contrast to finish with an old idea of René Descartes. Descartes always gets criticized. I don't want to criticize him too much. He was living in difficult times. But he said, for instance, that talking about other animals, that without minds to direct their movements, animals must be regarded as unthinking, unfeeling machines that move like clockwork. He called them bait machine or beast machines. For Descartes, the status of being alive was irrelevant to the status of being a conscious organism, at least the kind of consciousness that mattered. And I think entirely the opposite, that life and consciousness are intimately connected. We cannot understand consciousness except in light of our nature as living machines, and we perceive the world around us and ourselves within it through, and because of our living bodies. I want to finish there and just advertise the book for a second. Why not? I I think it is available in India now, which is great. And I'd be happy to move to the Q&A. Thank you for your attention. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Professor. That was absolutely fantastic. And I'm sure our attendees have had a lovely time listening to you, because there are so many questions that have dropped in. So I'm just going to quickly ask you a couple of questions that have come through the Q&A tab, as well as our social media handles. So the first question that we have here is obviously someone who's done their homework on you, because the question goes that you've previously written a book called I Benders, The Science of Seeing and Believing, but that was a book on optical illusions for kids. Why did you write a book on such a deep level of consciousness for adults, and what caused and why isn't there a book for kids about consciousness? Why aren't more neuroscientists writing about consciousness for kids?
That's actually a terrific idea. And so I Benders actually hold on. Yeah, this is like an earlier book, and it is for kids. Actually, I co-wrote it with a guy called Clive Gifford, who's written a lot of children's books. So I was a sort of main consultant editor for it. So it was his thing, really. I'd never written a kids book before. It was really rewarding experience, and it went down very well. And I think that's a fantastic idea. Maybe that'll be the next thing. Maybe that'll be the next thing I do. And in fact, one of the projects I'm doing this year it's a big art science project, firstly in the UK, but then hopefully in other places in the world. And it's all about perception and how we all see the world differently. You know, we all have different brains. We all perceive different things. There was that famous example of the dress that was white and red, gold and white, or blue and black, and everybody loves that, but kids really love that. And in my experience, I don't have kids, but talking to parents, talking at schools and things, kids are fascinated by these big questions about consciousness, about free will, about who am I? Where was I before I was born? And there's a natural curiosity that certainly in the UK education systems are totally unresponsive to. They're not part of any curriculum. We get educated out of these big questions and maybe come back to them. I mean, I came back to it, but I was kind of lucky. So I think this part of this big project we're doing in the UK is we're trying to get into every single school in the UK at the age for kids about the age of 7 to 8, and then again at 11 to 12, with a set of resources to get them thinking about these questions and hopefully ignite a more lasting interest. So I think I should write another book. Great idea. Thank you for the question.
Thank you so much. The next question that we have here is, so there's so much conversation going on about AI and technology and how robots are now going to understand human emotions. So have you personally worked between the areas of tech and consciousness, wherein robots can be made more conscious in the coming years, and what's your take on that?
Yeah, another great question. In fact, I'm pretty active in that area. In fact, I work close. So part of my group, my PhD was in AI, and my first job as a postdoc was building robots that based on neuroanatomy, based on the brain mechanisms of perception. So it was a very fascinating area, and quite a good chunk of my group at the moment is working in machine learning and AI at this interface. So my take on this, there's a chapter in the book on this, but I think there's a lot of hubris within the tech and AI communities about conscious robots or conscious machines, and part of this is fueled by science fiction, Terminators, and so on. And part of it, I think, is fueled by a set of insufficiently examined assumptions about what consciousness is. We humans, we think we're smart, and we know we're conscious, so we think the two go together. And then we also think that, okay, so then a computer, when it becomes sufficiently smart, will also become conscious. Now, for me, there's no justification for that assumption whatsoever. It originates from this residual anthropocentrism where we think we're so special in the universe. And my work, and I didn't design it to end up this way, but it's led me to the recognition that consciousness is much more deeply entwined with being alive than with being smart. So I don't think you're going to get conscious AI until you start building living machines. But I also don't think we should even be trying to do it. Right? I mean, what is the point? It's not a cool thing to do, which is what tech communities tend to do things because they think, hey, it's cool. But if you inadvertently built a conscious machine, and maybe it is possible out of silicon, I don't actually know. I don't think anybody knows for sure whether consciousness can be implemented on a non-biological system. If you did it by accident or by design, then you've introduced uncontrolled amounts of potential suffering into the universe, and that is an ethically unconscionable thing to do. So I'm very vocal against people sort of gung-ho trying to build conscious machines for the hell of it.
Very well put, and I must say that's a very, very honest admission. Not many researchers are so absolutely candid about their take on things. That was really nice to hear. The next question that we have is actually a very interesting one. Professor Seth, I came to know about you and your research in the area of consciousness, which is a very interesting field, and I have registered for the Riken Bio conference that's happening in Japan. I hope to see you there. And they have asked you, since they're from a chemistry background, they've asked you about your work with chemistry researchers, and if you have any take on how important chemistry is in the science of studying consciousness. What are the correlations, and what can chemists do while researching on consciousness?
This is another wonderful question. I think the first thing to say about that is that I think chemistry has been hugely underplayed in its role in consciousness research, but in neuroscience and in psychology in general. And this is because we still have this hangover of thinking about the brain as a computer. Like, so we tend to think what's really important are the neurons and the connections and information flow and all this stuff. And if you think of the brain as a computer, then you tend to forget that the brain, in a sense, it's an electrical machine. Yeah, it's networks and synapses as action potential, super important, but it's also a chemical machine. It's awash with neurotransmitters. It's awash with all kinds of substances whose interactions are best understood at the level of neurochemistry. It does happen, of course. There's very active branches of neuropharmacology and so on, but I think it's not that well integrated into our understanding of consciousness itself. We tend to think, like in the view I've been talking about, people talk about things like dopamine in terms of modulating the balance between predictions and sensory signals and so on. The closest I've come to it personally is in my collaborations about psychedelics. And here it's fascinating, right? Because we have substances like LSD and psilocybin and DMT, and we know the neurochemistry very well, that they activate very specifically serotonin 2A receptors, and we know where these receptors are, and this is all lovely. And we know that they generate massive changes in conscious experience. But the middle bit is still very unclear. Like quite why does this it's not just changes serotonin and you change conscious experience. Of course, there's lots going on in the middle. So part of my collaborative work is to understand how the pharmacology interacts with measures of like global brain dynamics that explain why psychedelic experiences are the way they are. And that's one example, I think, of a productive collaboration between the chemists and the neuroscientists and the philosophers.
Thank you. That was a really lovely example. I think the next question that we can take is, does consciousness have a genetic or an epigenetic component?
Almost certainly, right? I mean, it's like, I think everything, certainly for creatures, there will be a genetic component. Quite how useful that is in explaining, like, I don't think it's not that genetics is going to address the big question. And, in this, like solving the genetic code allowed us to understand genetics. It doesn't allow us to then understand consciousness. But at a very basic level, clearly, yes, like the way we visually experience the world depends on our visual cortex. That is shaped by both genetics and epigenetics. You know, we're not born as, you know, I think certain aspects of our, and I think this relates, I think, put it this way, when you think about perception as this process of predictions and prediction errors, you can ask the question, where do the predictions come from? Why does the brain have these prior expectations? Well, you can say they partly come from evolution, right? So that they can be, if for things that are very stable, like light comes from above, is a very stable aspect of our environment. That could be expected to be a prior belief that shapes our conscious experience that is encoded genetically. But other things are developed more epigenetically. You know, they depend on where we've grown up, what happens within our environment during ontogeny, and so other things happen during our daily life. And then another take on it would be, okay, there's a lot of variety in conscious experiences. So some people, for instance, have synesthesia, so they will experience colors when they hear sounds, for instance, or see letters. It's a fascinating phenomenon. Again, we've looked into this quite a bit in Sussex. And there's an active search for, okay, is there a genetic basis for something like synesthesia? I think it's very likely that there is. And then it'll be interesting to say, okay, if there are genetic markers of synesthesia, do they explain anything about it? Do, for instance, they lead to increased cross-wiring between different parts of cortex? So yes, I think it's a useful approach too. It's not something that I've directly worked with, though, genetics.
Thank you for answering that so well. Professor, the next question that we have here is, you know, there's so much of talk going on around consciousness and dreams, very, very deeply explored topic, if I can say that. And there are so many neuroscientists who've been actively researching on dreams and the consciousness behind it. So the question goes, what's your opinion on subconscious brain activities like dreams, while comparing it with real-time conscious brain activity? How does it work?
Well, I think dreams are not subconscious. I think dreams are conscious, right? We just don't remember them very well, and that's really a good thing. Otherwise, we'd be very confused. It'd be hard to know whether a memory was of a real world or of something that happened in a dream if we remembered our. So actually, people often find it frustrating, but I'm quite glad that dreams are difficult to remember. I think that's necessary. I think dreams are absolutely fascinating phenomenon. We are conscious, but we're conscious in a different way. I mean, we sort of lack this reflective self-awareness. Weird things happen that we don't experience as being weird at the time. Tends to be less smell and so on. Why do we dream is one of these old questions, right? Freud tried to talk about it. There's so many different ideas about dream, and a lot of them are often about interpreting the content of dreams somehow. Now, one idea that I think is quite different, that I find quite appealing, and it's just a hypothesis at the moment. I think it's a number of people have had a similar idea, but it's best articulated by an American researcher called Eric Howell at the moment. And it's this idea that, again, back to the brain as this prediction machine. You can think of during the day, our real-time online perception is continuously training this model inside the brain that's generating predictions about the world. Now, in statistics, we know that if we overfit to data, we don't generalize to new situations very well. This is a well-known problem in any kind of machine learning or statistics. You train it out to particular data, you're not going to generalize. How do you do that? Well, how do you deal with that? Well, what you can do is there are all sorts of ways to like renormalize your model so that you prevent it overfitting. Dreaming for me and for Eric might be what's happening there. Basically, the brain is kind of running its generative models offline in order to compensate for the potential overfitting during the day. which would mean, to put it in a very simply, that we dream so that we can see, so that we can perceive better the next day.
Let me just ask you a couple of last questions, because we're running over time and they're just so simple to cover. Maybe we can take 2 more questions from the audience, and that'll we'll move towards the conclusion of the session. Okay, so you've obviously worked with many researchers, making your field of study highly interdisciplinary. So what has your experience been while working with philosophers, and while their take on consciousness might be different from yours? How has your experience been in terms of the interdisciplinary aspects of consciousness?
Yeah, so this is another really good question. I mean, I think it goes back to the schools thing in a way, that we all labor within these disciplines, and I always found that a bit frustrating, that the world isn't organized according to these different disciplines, or really, like, it is to some extent, but not completely. And the disciplines that we see in university departments and the subjects that you choose at school, they're mainly there because it's administratively convenient for them to be there. It's not because nature is completely carved at these joints. And I had a big worry going into science, that I thought it would be about increasing specialization. So every stage you throw another subject or discipline away until eventually you know everything about something that nobody else cares about. And this was a big worry, but it was a real relief to me that it didn't turn out that way. That actually, if you're guided by the questions, then the disciplines, such as they are, organize themselves around the questions. And that for me is like the single piece of advice for sort of young, aspiring scientists, philosophers, whatever. Keep focused on the questions. Don't think about the curriculum or the whatever, and then it'll become clear what tools and what things you need to study. So I was always, and in consciousness, of course, it's so obvious that you can't encapsulate it within a single discipline. Philosophy is critical. Psychology, neuroscience, computer science, maths, physics, all play a role. The humanities too, anthropology too. But philosophy is a very interesting example, because for a long time, consciousness was the territory of philosophy. And so there was an interesting period where there was sort of a bit of a, I would say, difficult interaction, where philosophers were not so receptive to neuroscientists or psychologists, and neuroscientists and psychologists who were studying consciousness was sort of, steered clear of the philosophy and just made, did interesting experiments, but interpreted them in quite naive ways. One of the joys that I've had being in this area over the last 20 years or so is seeing a much more productive interaction between science and philosophy. Some of my mentors, like Daniel Dennett, have really led the charge there, and they've been, people who've brought scientists and philosophers together. And I work with philosophers very closely now. I've just written a big review paper on theories of consciousness with a philosopher. And now I think if you're a philosopher interested in consciousness, you have to know, or at least be open to, the neuroscience as well. It's just like it won't work. And the same goes the other way around. If you're a neuroscientist or physicist or biologist, you have to at least know the territory of philosophy. You're not going to go very far if you don't. But fortunately, this is a really fun thing to do. And it's at these interdisciplinary interactions that there's the most progress to be made and the most to learn.
Thank you so much. That was such a lovely answer. I think there are so many researchers and scientists who have come on the ISF platform, and all of them seem to be echoing the same statement that, they're tired of being boxed into these categories. While science is so interdisciplinary in nature, they work with multiple streams, multiple disciplines on a daily basis. I think we've got to start looking at science very differently. And, that was such a lovely answer. I think we'll take one last question and conclude this session. Professor, we've received 2 questions on qualia. So what do you think of qualia according to your views of consciousness? Can qualia be mapped to neural processes?
Yeah, this really gets at, I think, back to the beginning of the talk about these views of the hard problem, the real problem, illusionism, panpsychism. So qualia, the way I understand the term, it is like, that is the stuff of a conscious experience. Like it's the redness of red, the sharpness of a pain. And I think this is where I have a little bit of a sympathy for illusionism. Like, what do we mean by qualia? Do we literally mean some sort of experience stuff that is, I don't know, floating in the brain, or that is some aspect of information processing, whatever? I'm not sure that's the most productive way to think. So Dennett, again, one of these, I think, really powerful thinkers in this area. He had this famous paper called Quine and Qualia. Talks about this fallacy of double transduction. So like I open my eyes, I see a color in the world, right? Now, I know we all know from Newton, from many people, that colors don't objectively exist in the world anyway, right? They're just electromagnetic radiation, which is colorless. But I still experience a color as being out there in the world. Now, how do we think about that? Well, it's certainly not the case that there is color in the world, that it's then detected by some combination of wavelengths and then somehow reconstructed in the brain. So there's nothing literally green in the brain, right? So qualia doesn't exist in that sense. Like there is no, the greenness is nowhere. The greenness actually isn't anywhere. It's in the interaction between the brain and the world. So I think there's there's one way to think that qualia, for me, it's like the same thing to say generally about consciousness. Yes, qualia exist, but they may not be what we think they are.
Thank you so much. And that brings us to the end of this session. Professor Seth, it was an absolute pleasure to hear your talk and to interact with you. And thank you so much for having taken so many questions from our audiences. Next time, we can only hope to host you on ground, offline in India at this massive celebration of science. Last words for our audiences. We have a majority of undergraduate students who are just stepping into different disciplines of science, technology, engineering, maths, and are, of course, exploring science communication, science policy. So your final, maybe concluding remarks for all of them. And I'd love to know what you think about public engagement platforms such as ISF, given you've been such an active science communicator yourself and have been giving so many talks on public engagement platforms. So just final words from you.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, well, again, it's been a real pleasure. Thanks. I'd love to be there in person too. I was supposed to be in India in a couple of weeks for one of my nephew's weddings, but that's all been postponed because of COVID and all this stuff. So, you know, another time. But yeah, so public engagement, I think I love it. I mean, I love doing it. It's not, I think it's difficult. It's not, so a lot of, I've been lucky to get some funding to do it, to sort of buy myself out of some teaching. It's often thought of as something people do in their spare time, which you can, but to do it well takes a lot of time. But I think it's hugely important. You know, science is it's something to celebrate. It's something to share. Not everybody needs to do it. So when I talk about public engagement, universities here, it's like, you know, don't get the impression that everybody needs to be doing all this, but some people need to do it. And if you are going to do it, it's worth putting quite some time into it. And so platforms like ISF, I think, are wonderful. So the more science, there's just such a flowering of science festivals. There's a general engagement with science, which I think is wonderful to see. And sort of an India specific point. So as I said, I have close family links there and come often to mainly the UP area. And one thing is that there's been not very much, like I would say India is really strong in certain areas of academia, right? In engineering, computer science, so on, chemistry. But psychology and neuroscience have not been massively prominent in academia in India. And I think that's changing. You know, I'd like to see it change more. I think these are fundamental disciplines for the next century. I know there are some excellent places like my friend Narayan Srinivasan and IIT Kanpur has got a department. It used to be in Allahabad, which is why I know him, which is where my family are from. So there are a number of good places, but yeah, I mean, I would just like to see the fire of cognitive science, neuroscience really ignite in India. That would be wonderful.
So much, Professor Seth. And on that note, we hope that your talk has inspired our budding scientists and researchers in the audience to really look up cognitive neurosciences and do a little more research on the same. A very big thank you from the entire team at India Science Festival, Fast India, to you for joining us. And we really hope to host you at ISF in the future too. To all our attendees, make sure to look up Professor Seth's website. He's put it in the chat, and you can also look up his book on Amazon. It's out. It's called Being You, A New Science of Consciousness. You can check it out and make sure to tell us what you thought about the session. We're going to drop a feedback form in the chat. Do tell us what we can do to improve our sessions. Thank you so much, Professor Seth. It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been an honor to speak to you and to your audience. Thank you so much. Have a lovely evening.
So much, Professor. And with that, we're going to move on to the next bit, the final session for day 2 of India Science Festival. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome Professor Venkatesh Naranamurthy, joining us all the way from the USA. Professor, good morning to you, and thank you so much for joining us. It's really exciting to have you here with us today. And we have, this is also going to be an ISF book talk where we're going to be talking about his latest book that has come out and is going to be available to the Indian audiences after Jan 20th on Amazon. We've dropped a link in the chat. Make sure to look it up. A quick introduction about our speaker here today. It is with great pleasure that I get to welcome Professor Venkatesh Naranamurthy, the Benjamin Pierce Professor of Technology and Public Policy, Engineering and Applied Sciences and Physics from Emeritus at Howard University. He's the former Vice President for Research at Sandia National Laboratories, a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and elected members of the US National Academy of Engineering. He lectures widely on solid-state computer communication and energy technologies, as well as on the management of science, tech, public policy, and has served on numerous advisory boards of the federal government, research universities, professional societies, national laboratories, and industry. A scientist, a researcher, a public policy leader, and an academic administrator, Professor Murthy has donned several hats and has proven to be an extraordinary thought leader in multiple fields. I have a very small anecdote to share with our attendees. I read somewhere in an interview online, and Professor Murthy also shared this with me, that he's of the opinion that academic institutions are very, very formal in nature, and he's always gone by the name of Venki everywhere. And Drew Faust, the 28th president of Howard University, made fun of the fact that Professor Murthy goes by the name of Venki everywhere, and it's almost like he's like Madonna. He has one name and that's all he uses. And he's given me the liberty of calling him Venki. So Venki, thank you so much for joining in. Absolute pleasure to host you at India Science Festival. How are you doing? And tell us how you're feeling about joining the festival. You're on mute.
Can you hear me now? Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay, yes, because you had to unmute. So I'm delighted to be here this morning, and I hope we can have a lively discussion. I joined in for the latter part of the last talk, and one of the things which we'll hopefully can discuss a little later, and is a central part of the book. In case, I'm surprised that they're only showing it in India in January. It has been available in the States since November. I'm going to have to tell Harvard University Press, why is India treated differently? So it is widely available in the States. And I would love to discuss really how research in science and engineering and technology needs to be done. So that's, I think it's very important for the future of the world, and also for a country like India, which is developing at a fast pace. And of course, we have a long intellectual tradition in various aspects, but now how science and technology are to evolve is an important thing, and how it relates to society. So so the future leaders of India, presumably in this audience, the undergraduates, the graduate students, and that's why I went to universities, and that was also the case for Bell Labs. So I'd love to engage in a dialogue with you, and then hopefully indirectly with the audience.
So much, Venki. I'm sure that the future leaders of SNT sitting in the audience today are very, very excited to ask you all of their questions. And for all our audience members, we are going to be discussing Venki's latest book that he has co-written along with Jeffrey Sau, The Genesis of Techno-Scientific Revolutions. We've dropped a link in the chat about the book and where it can be found. Like Venki just said, it's already released in the US, and hopefully we'll see it super soon in India too. I'm going to be asking Venki a couple of questions as I had the pleasure of reading the book myself a couple of days ago. And I request all the audience members to drop in their questions in the Q&A tab, and I'll make sure to relay them to Venki towards the end of this conversation. So Venki, I'm sure you've received this question a lot of times, but I'm also very curious to know. We've heard about scientific revolutions, we've heard about technological revolutions, but this book in particular, let's just look at the title. It talks about techno-scientific revolutions. I'm very curious to know why you used this particular phrase and what was the thought process behind it. Over to you.
Thank you very much for that. That, of course, is the nub of the whole book. And I've been thinking a lot about this subject ever since I started doing first research in physics and in material science, and then over a long period as I got more involved with public policy. And I've discovered a common fallacy. There is Thomas Kuhn, a famous, in fact, a former Harvard professor, wrote a famous book on the structure of scientific revolutions. It was really about theoretical physics, the great theoretical physicists like Einstein and Newton and so on. And of course, in today's world, we all think of great technological things, from the iPhone, which is today, to in the past, the light bulb and the telephone, etc. But these were always thought as two separate kind of things. What I learned over a period of time, that actually they are so intimately interrelated. And that's what I learned when I went to Bell Labs from my PhD from Cornell, and learned how, in fact, the transistor, which really caused the big information technology revolution, the fact that Indian technology companies like Infosys and Tata Computing Services have succeeded is because, in fact, transistors were first invented and nucleated to the community. But the transistor was invented not just individually, but rather it was a union of physics, material science, and electrical engineering. It was actually a genuine merger. So in my view, techno-scientific is an important part of the future. You heard this previous talk, I only came towards the end. If you look at neuroscience, and if you look at biology, it turns out biology has a lot to do and similarity with engineering. Nature evolved in periodic time in complicated networks. Engineers design complicated networks, and in fact, they have a lot to learn from each other. Today, there are fields like systems neuroscience. Systems is more an engineering discipline. You have fields like synthetic biology. Synthetic is engineered materials. And you think of all of these features, the world has completely changed. And in fact, it is a missing term in the discourse. Technology and science are closely intertwined. Sometimes the technology leads the science, and sometimes the science leads the technology. It's a mistake to believe it all comes from pure science. In fact, technology came first. Humans, the key technology of the human are the eyes, the nose, which breathes, the ears through which you are hearing. And then engineering basically increases the technology by having telescopes, microscopes, etc., amplifiers, computers, etc., and they're adjuncts to technology. And eyeglasses and the steam engine came long before the laws of thermodynamics. Eyeglasses came long before we knew optics. So in fact, we've learned thermodynamics to make better steam engines. So we have to, the same thing, but in the transistor case, the physics and the engineering happened together. So we really want to look at this holistic union of these two fields and not think of them separately. It's a very important thing for future of education. We have too many engineering schools, which really only want to, and too many science schools, which only want to do science. So we are talking about this deeper union. That doesn't mean the other things are bad, but this is an important missing element in the discourse. Have I made that clear?
Absolutely. I think that's that is very well put. And I think that that plays into my next question very well. The byline of the book sort of goes like the nature and nurture of research. And you've spoken about this extensively in the book. So let's talk about the evolution of research over the years, especially since the festival is themed around continuum. Where have we come from? Where are we headed? It goes without saying that, you mentioned in a previous talk that the inspiration was for writing this book was because you and Jeff both believe that research was due for a rethink, one consistent with its nature as deeply holistic and its nurturing as deeply human. We would love for you to give us an example from your personal experience as to how the approach towards research has evolved through the years and what your expectations are for our approach towards research in the future.
Yeah, so I think this is a very vast question. You could write literally whole books on it because people have written about history of science and history of technology, and we're now trying to do a union of the two. But I think what is really dawned on me is when I started thinking about nature of scientific and technological institutions in the School of Public Policy. I sort of knew it because I had worked at Bell Labs, I'd worked at Sanjay National Labs, and then in universities, and had had these varied experiences. And it turns out that most of early research, also when C.V. Raman did his work in India in 1930, it were isolated university places and other places in Europe and other, etc. And it was not a coordinated activity in today's world, where governments are putting significant resources. And the reason this happened was actually after World War II. Science and technology were becoming important. My own father went and worked for the Royal Air Force to design lightweight aircraft underground, and because in World War II. And of course, the United States won World War II because of the atom bomb, which was an outgrowth of physics and of engineering. And but really there were other aspects like radar, proximity fuels, synthetic rubber, that in fact, the United States decided that there needs to be a large public investment in science and technology because they're so important for national security and also for economic development. And in fact, Pandit Nehru in India created the IITs as a recognition that in fact you needed to create institutions like MIT. So I think the real thing for me which bothered me was the public discourse in the United States, especially led by Vannevar Bush, Dean of Engineering at MIT. You all should go and read his famous treatise to President Truman and Roosevelt, Science, the Endless Frontier, where everything he ascribed the success of World War II to science. And I asked, when I was teaching my course at the Kennedy School, I asked a postdoctoral fellow of mine, Tolu Odomusu, who was supporting me and who wrote an earlier book with me, I said, just see how many times he refers to science and how many times does he refer to engineering. He referred to science 130 times and engineering 4 times. I said, the atom bomb, you can say, fine, it was really Einstein and physics. But then the proximity fuse, I think of electrical engineering. If I think of synthetic rubber, I think of chemical engineering. I said, there's something wrong, that there is something misguided here. And then, of course, when I learned about Bell Labs and my own thesis about Cornell had taught me how important materials were, that you didn't do physics without the materials, and the materials had to be synthesized, they had to be engineered. They are essentially interrelated. Physics was too dominated by high energy physics and as a very pure, so-called pure discipline. And in fact, when Vannevar Bush wrote that article, he had one of his advisors, the former president of Bell Labs. He said, people were using the word pure research. In India, they use the word pure science, as if anything else is impure. And in fact, Frank Jewett told Bush, why are you doing that? Does that mean everything we do at Bell Labs is impure? And Bell Labs just made so many discoveries. So in fact, he changed the word and called it basic research. But Bell Labs had a view that you don't separate basic and applied research. That's the whole point. The transistor was invented because you combined physics with materials engineering and device engineering. And physics you learn by doing. It's not just a theory. It is you do an experiment and you try to verify that experiment. Only then is it real physics. It is physics about the natural world. It is done by actually verifying what you actually observe. So not to forget that. Theory is important, but it is only part of the story. Purity makes no sense. It is a holistic union of the two. And in fact, neuroscience, which is really how the brain works, which is really how signals are, is really electrical engineering in many ways. And what we have learned in electrical engineering and neuroscience have to be brought together along with all kinds of other features, along with computing, along with how we do it. So I think this is really important. So I hope I've answered your question in some fashion. It's a very complicated story, which you really do have to, but I think those log jams have to be broken and they're beginning to be broken. So we should not just say we'll do science. This is a problem. We should say, what impact does it have? You might want to do some frontier in physics. There's nothing wrong with that. But you need to know, and the goal of research is a meta goal of looking for the surprise for what is new and what is different. Einstein was great, and so was Edison. You can argue who was greater. So don't elevate one to the other. We talk about diversity and equality and talk about all of these features. Think of that deeper union of disciplines. So it's a holistic view.
Sense. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, I do think that there is a disparity in the way we look at scientists and technologists. I mean, there seems to be this power imbalance of sorts.
Yes.
Too.
Yeah. And it's on both sides. The technologists can say, oh, look, you're just doing something, you're not at all important. And that's what we have to conquer. It's not an easy thing. And that doesn't mean advancing physics is a bad thing. It's not against physics. But we really have to think of it holistically. And I don't make physics more important than engineering or more important than chemistry or more important than biology. New things happen in each one of these areas. New things happen even in social science. So you really need to develop a very healthy respect for this.
I think that ties into the next question very well. There is one aspect of the book that particularly appealed to me, in which you mentioned the 3 guiding principles for nurturing research related to governance, culture, and people. And I would like to really know how you decided to zero in on these 3 guiding principles, because there are so many different aspects to research, yet you managed to boil it down to these 3. What was the inspiration behind that?
So this is, it's very, the outgrowth, partly of my own personal lived experiences of 50 years, first as a bench researcher, then actually becoming a leader at Bell Labs, and then a leader in a national laboratory where it was a public service mission, and then becoming dean at universities where it was an educational mission, and to really nurture and deal with creative people. But I had, when I started going into public policy from basic physics, so-called physics research, I started thinking about how to actually connect to the larger society. And I had this postdoctoral fellow of mine, and I said, you know, Bell Labs was a great institution. We intuitively knew it was great. So many Nobel Prizes came and so many technology came. It was not just physics. It was all kinds of technology. And I said, we should really start articulating more clearly how such a place worked. And of course, it's not the only place. There are other great industrial laboratories. There was DuPont, there was IBM, there was Xerox PARC. And in fact, Germany had some great ones as well. So I wanted to, and I started now doing actually, if you like, social science by having this postdoc of mine go and interview a whole lot of people who had worked in these kind of institutions, at Bell Labs, at Santa Barbara, at Janelia Farm. Go look at Janelia Farm. It's a new institution in biology, which has actually been funded about 10 years, 15 years ago, modeled after Bell Labs in the biology area. And of course, there are many such now. So I had him continue a whole lot of, so what others said. And then I tried to integrate all of these. And Jeff questioned me. He came and wanted to interview me. And then we said, we really need to synthesize this in a good way. So that's what then, so then I said, how do we synthesize it? Because very often people have viewed research, well, we just hire some people, give them the freedom, let them do whatever they want. That's not quite correct, because obviously somebody still has to select what has to be done. Somebody has to make sure they're given the right report of support. Somebody has to understand all of these. And therefore, it requires some leader. It requires somebody who makes those decisions. And one of the people in universities often say, well, we'll just have peer review. Peer review is an important thing, but not at all sufficient. Because science or research can be a conservative force. What people agree, and then, but however, research is about the new. It is actually to actually disrupt what is the conservative thing. That's what happens. Einstein blew Newton completely from the water by this relativity, or Edison really changed how light was to be generated by inventing the light bulb. And there are, of course, current examples. So I think this disruption requires certain contrarians as well. People who do not just want to verify, but who question. The point that Dr. Seth was making, that questioning part. So we have a whole chapter on all of those features. So the leadership also becomes important, and how you are funded. So if you want 1,000 flowers to bloom, you can also have 10,000 weeds. Somebody has to nurture the flowers, feed and fertilize the flowers, and somebody has to kill the weeds. That's the responsibility, which is not often properly understood. So the researchers are very important, but the research leadership and how they are supported. That's why the nurturing part is very important, because the fragility of research, because you are the contrarians. So it's very important that the contrarian be part of the system, and he or she may need to be protected. And when people talk about diversity today, that's why if you want to impact society, the whole research area is a social enterprise. You go to conferences, not just to listen to talks, but you meet with a lot of other people while you're having coffee, while you're having beer with them. You learn all kinds of things. It's a social endeavor. Research groups are social endeavors, and we must understand the culture. So the leaders must propagate the right culture. People have to be mentored, and the research to be successful. It's a very important thing. I don't like the word manager. The manager is wrong. Leaders have a vision, but their main job is to make the success of the people in that organization. So that was an important element. And second, not to forget how great advances occur, to think of science and technology holistically. Don't elevate physics over chemistry or chemistry over biology, as Comte and maybe Europeans did, or even the British did. That was the whole point, and we need to change. So this really becomes important for a country like India. For a while, there is still this divide. And I want the students, if you're really passionate by theory, go do it. There's nothing wrong with that. But we do want you to think and respect the other person as well. And that's really important. Do what you really want to do. I want to do experiments. Somebody might want to do theory. Somebody may only want to do physics. That's okay. But that doesn't mean you don't respect the other people. And at the same time, the organization has to be such that you recognize those who are the really creative people, nurture them, and yet that's why it needs to be made more effective. Sometimes you just throw the money around and we say, and research has a meta goal, a larger goal. If you want to influence society, that has to be the meta goal, but there are a lot of proximate goals in the way, and the researcher needs to have flexibility to go across, not to be treated in a bureaucratic way as accountants would, but rather in a more nuanced way where in fact the long-term output is understood. So there are a whole bunch, it's very complex, but this is from a whole bunch of interviews, personal lived experiences to really identify these things. And very important part is to encourage the informed contrarian, a point which actually the previous speaker was making when I joined in at the end about the reason to have questions in addition to answers. Sometimes you only look at verifying hypothesis testing. You want to verify the hypothesis, but finding the right hypothesis is actually more important. That's what it is about. Imagination. It is going across with a contrary point of view. That's how Edison was. That's how Alexander Graham Bell was. And that today Steve Jobs was. People didn't want to integrate computing and communication and actually make touchscreen displays, etc. And Steve Jobs had the vision. So it's a different kind of vision, but really thinking outside the box. So I hope I've tried to explain to you, it is a very complicated ecosystem, but this distills in a various way, the leadership part, the support part, as well as the environment. So culture is really, really important. That is why you want to have diversity, because you do want to encourage that debate. But then there still has to be somebody. The judge may not be right always. Great leaders make mistakes. I've made many mistakes, but that doesn't matter. But at the same time, over some period, you will have encouraged the contrarian and done something new.
It was very well put, Venki. I do agree with you. There are so many layers to this. You can't approach it from a single perspective. There's just
Yes.
ways to look at it. And I completely agree with you when you say, I mean, there's nobody stopping you from doing the kind of work that you wish to do, but at no point of time does one science become superior over the other. And there's no need to look down upon any stream here. Everybody's doing relevant work. So,
and this creativity in many disciplines, it requires different types of creativity. There's some kind of creativity for reductionist physics and some kind of creativity for complex systems like systems neuroscience.
Absolutely. I think I'm going to move to the next question that I have. We're also getting a lot of questions from the audience, so I'll take them through the course of this conversation too. There's a very beautiful quote by Ralph Brown that has been paraphrased in the book. Research environments reflect human relationships and group spirit. In short, successful research institutions should never forget that they are human institutions and they should place people above structure. Research environments are often known to be restrictive in nature and more often than not quite repressive. Don't you think that our approach towards research has to become a lot more human, and that this will require a very radical shift in mindset that will take a very long time, especially in the Indian context? What's your take on that?
Yeah, so of course, it's a long time since I actually worked in the Indian context. I did work for a year at National Physical Laboratory and for a year at the Indian Institute of Technology in Mumbai. And of course, it has changed a lot. My own father was a scientist as well, or a researcher. But I think the human environment part relates to my earlier discussion. It really is. Ralph Bowen was the vice president or director of research at Bell Labs, an IEEE Medal of Honor winner, when the transistor was invented. So he started giving, and transistor is arguably one of the most important technological discoveries, period. I mean, there's only, along with the light bulb, with the telephone, the transistor, they probably are. And of course, now there are many more coming along, but they are different. So he gave speeches, and Bell Labs in those days had a very good recording system, and all speeches were actually recorded as technical memoranda. And in looking at the history, this is another thing. When I said, how did I write this book? I had this undergraduate student in physics who actually was interested in history of physics and so on. And I said, go look at this archives at Bell Labs, call the Bell Labs librarian. And then she found this speech. And I said, there's a man who was a vice president of Bell Labs at that time. And will you just dig out his speeches? So she dug out his speech. And, you know, it's never been published. I've now published it in my book. It is there. Okay. He wrote this thing. He says, you know, they're really human environments. I can have a building and I can burn down the building. It's only a physical infrastructure which I can recreate. It's just a question of money. But if the physicists, the engineers, and the people doing the work are no longer there, the place cannot function. You can have the biggest, most shiny building of marble, but that won't do you any good. So the people become really important. So who you recruit, how you nurture and deal with them, and the culture, where Bell Labs was the one where you were a part of a giant family, there was civil rivalry. It's always a balance between cooperation and competition, just like balance between disciplines. So in fact, you want to have that leader who can foster that group spirit, but yet encourage that individual excellence. This is not an easy thing, just like working across disciplines. And that is what Ralph Bowen was talking about. That's what Bell Labs is. So identify really creative people, where how you interview them and recruit them, because you want to look for their imagination. You're looking for people who have that questioning attitude. I've been accused. That's one thing about physics. It teaches you to question. Many of my friends, oh, you're always questioning. But that's the questioning, you get to ultimately the right answer. Of course, question and answers feed on each other. It's a cycle. Think of things as a cycle. So the human environment, not to forget that, too often forgotten by bureaucrats, too often forgotten by accountants. So if you look at great institutions, so this Tolo Odomusu went and interviewed people at Janelia Farm, And it was modeled after Bell Labs. And a young postdoc says, sir, the reason this place works so well, the administrators and the bureaucrats are trying to help and make my work better than finding solutions to my problems. So that is what good leadership is. That's what good nurturing is. And that's what Ralph Bowen was. The second important point, that you never forget combining theory with practice. That is, the practical person is just as important as the theoretical person. John Bardeen, double Nobel Prize in physics, sat side by side with Bratton, who made with materials the transistor as they took data. That was the hallmark. Furthermore, they just didn't say we did this. They actually put the signal into an amplifier so that it generated sound. Only then did they call Ralph Bowen to the lab, say it actually worked. So if you have a great idea, you must actually take it to practice. We have too many labs in India where we just do some theory and never. So actually the joy which you get by seeing the fruits of your work actually come is really an important part of both physics and engineering, and more broadly of research. So you must actually connect it in important ways. So I hope that was essential. So Ralph Bowen, for me, I thought I was a great leader. I said, no, this man thought about all this 50 years before me. The reason they hired these people was because that's how it perpetuates. So it starts. So it was started. So leadership is important. This is true at Santa Barbara. The chancellor had the right vision. He got the right deans, etc. And a change is as strong as the weakest link. So you need the very great researchers. You need the great faculty. You need the students in the university, and then you need the right leadership. Otherwise, it won't work. And they need the right support.
That's very interesting. You've touched upon a couple of points that lead into my next question very well. I'm going to pick up questions from the audience. You spoke about funding and the relation between the industry and research, these two spheres that seem to be very far from each other or are not being tapped into very well. There is this one question that we received, which says, what is the contribution of Indian industry and big industrial houses in funding fundamental research in the basic sciences when compared to organizations in the West? How can we have big industrial houses really supporting research? What's your take on it?
Yeah, I think this is a very important question in the long-term situation for India. And if you look at history, it turns out, my impression is still limited, that in the old days, actually, in India, the Tatas were very good in recognizing the importance of research. And they, in fact, Tatas funded the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore, and then the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. But that tradition is not as common as it should be. And if you look at India, I had a postdoc who's now at the Indian Institute of Technology at Delhi, Ajinkya Kamath, who actually looked at multinational companies which have come to India. There's an IBM research, there is General Electric set up a big laboratory in Bangalore, etc. So the industrial houses of the US realized that India had talent and set up these R&D labs in different parts of India. And in fact, we found they were generating a lot of patents, etc. But the Indian industrial houses weren't quite doing it. So I think this is very important. It requires two to tango. There needs to be a greater tradition of the larger industrial houses to have R&D, and that's how you can interface with the universities, etc. So this whole ecosystem has to be developed, and the attitudes in universities also have to change, and how this is encouraged and fostered. So there is a lot to be learned in this, I would say, in this area, and be very important, not only for India, but for worldwide. This is extremely critical. So this is, I think we do need a much larger industrial R&D ecosystem, whether it's Reliance and others. Now green hydrogen, I'm told Reliance is beginning to study it, or Mahindra and all of the Tata. So they need to have a much stronger relationship with the Indian universities. One of the things which Nehru did very well was creating the IITs, but they really funded much of the research in research institutions, but not in the universities. That has been changing. So we need that university research ecosystem with the right combinations, along with the public funded, the CSIR laboratories, to actually function much more in a holistic way than in silos. So I think there are a whole bunch of strategic issues which need to be addressed for it to be fully realized. And the potential is there, but it is not yet there because of history. Yeah, China is doing very well in that area because they recognize that they're more of a top-down, and India is very democratic, which is good, but there's some dangers of this democracy. You still have to have a combination of that and past history, where this view of pure science, as if you get yourself sullied by doing something experiment. America became great because they actually were different from Europe. They didn't have this arrogance in this matter, but now if they become arrogant, they're going to lose their job. So I think you should look, I've not looked carefully. In India, where we did terribly was in manufacturing, in semiconductors, in those areas, because we didn't build in those R&D. But we've done reasonably well in space research. We've done reasonably well in what you call in pharmaceuticals and in the chemical industry. So somehow one has to understand, my own view of space was because it had a great leader in Vikram Sarabhai, who built a tradition, and they actually is kind of amazing. So India has done some very good things. So we have to now adapt that model appropriately where we connect to the larger issues of society.
Very interesting that you mentioned China. We had a discussion today on the history of science and its coming of age in the Indian context, where one of the speakers really highlighted how China's growth in science and technology really escalated in the previous years. While at some point of time we were on par, it's just the comparison, it cannot be done anymore, because China has really shot up in ways that it's just accelerated over the years. And I think with that, I can move on to the next question that we have here. One of your interviews, you mentioned that science, engineering, and all other disciplines are socially constructed. You've been an early champion of interdisciplinary initiatives and collaborations, and have often spoken about the need for S&T to grow in a liberal environment. And you've often been very critical of universities of doing research in a very, very repressive manner. And you've talked about how our approach towards research has been extremely linear. Why do you think it's so even in 2022? Where are we going wrong? And what are 2-3 very key points that we need to work on to make our research a lot more liberal in the coming years?
Yeah, it takes a long time to change any system because, traditions build up and so on. But first of all, research, just like any research organization, are socially constructed organization. Bell Labs was a socially constructed, which I realized only after I looked back and thought about how all the things work. So was the Edison Research Laboratory. So are universities. Harvard had a certain culture, Santa Barbara had a certain culture, etc., etc. So one has to understand that, in fact, it is not a monolithic thing, but I really think education, the ones which I've thought a lot about, is science, engineering, and technology, and its larger relationship. So I had this view, even at Santa Barbara, that technology had to be done in a different way than business schools. So in fact, when I looked at Stanford had been very successful. Silicon Valley actually came out because lots of Bell Labs people on the transistor went to Stanford, including Shockley and others, and that's how the ecosystem started. And in fact, when I went to Santa Barbara, people at Stanford wrote to me, Venki, you're very lucky. You're going to Santa Barbara, which is similar. But if you look at Stanford, they had a business school, but the technology came out of the engineering school. So the engineering was very important. And because they were not worried about management, they were worried about entrepreneurship, of actually doing something new. So at Santa Barbara, we didn't have a business school, and we realized that entrepreneurship could be a very important way. But we had to train the engineers in a different way of thinking. We had to train them to really understand some of the aspects of the business environment, but succeed in it with the curiosity-driven inventor mindset which engineers have. So I think there are several aspects here. Today, the thing which places like the Transistor and Bell Labs did was they developed communications technology. After all, this communication which we're doing over the internet here today is an outgrowth of that. And it is such a fundamental human thing that technology is no longer viewed like machines, like people had viewed in the old days, big factories and machines, but it's now in the palm of your hand, through your iPhone, through how we are communicating, etc. So the Bell Labs and the IBMs of this world actually changed how you thought about technology, because you had to deal with it. It became even more of a social activity. So it is important, since you must relate to the larger society. We have economists, we have business people, we have political scientists, we have artists and humanists, etc., that we actually train both the humanists and the social scientists in a different way. They must really understand in some ways what this iPhone is about. They don't understand how to make it in detail, but at least some of the basic principles of it. And the scientists and the engineers must understand how the society works. Because in fact, too often engineers, they're very strong in mathematics. I'm sure all of those who are from IIT, they're proud of all the math. They know more math even than physicists, because engineering relies so much on mathematics. And mathematics here is a tool. It's a technology, really, and you're learning. And so they were viewed as nerds. And that is not the right view of engineers. Engineers are the ones who want to change the world. They have a lot in common with arts. Arts are imagining, which comes out of the human mind. And engineering is also an art. So in fact, we need to bridge these divides. There are some engineers you need who really will be very specialized, but you do need to create a cadre of people in this broader milieu. That is, you want social scientists who understand at least the underpinnings of the technology. You know, I have a colleague, I started teaching course on technology and society, and people are used to electricity. They think electricity is clean because it comes out of the socket. They don't realize that the electricity is produced by some kind of burning coal or some kind of burning oil and all the pollution. So they don't even know exactly how that thing comes out of the socket. So I told Larry Summers, you can't have a Harvard-educated student not understanding this little bit. And you need to understand what ones and zeros are. What's the difference between a gene and a chromosome? If you don't understand those things, you're not a broadly educated person. So liberal education is an important thing, but it must change with the times. The social scientists and the humanists must understand at least how technology and science do. At the same time, scientists and technologists must understand some of the larger issues of society, that they must realize that their things are lots of unintended consequences. So they need to be sensitive to some of those unintended consequences and how you explain. If you look at the biggest crisis today, it is with the pandemic. The two biggest crises, climate and pandemic. Both have enormous amount of uncertainty. It is probabilistic, and we still do not know how to communicate to the public the roles of uncertainty. And we need to level with them, and this is a difficult problem. I don't know exactly how to do that. It's a very complex system, and over some period. However, at least we must try. We do need some good communicators where they will realize there is uncertainty, but they will trust you. And that trust has been lost because we have not been giving them consistency. The physicists lost their trust. Nuclear power lost its trust because we didn't take care of the radioactive waste properly. So we need to be also think through about the unintended consequences and build the trust and the ethics in the system. So it's a very complex system which we need to think about, but really we do need a cadre of people with this broader education. And in fact, the undergraduate education should be broad. The specialization comes later. It comes either the master's and the PhD level. So this broader, that is the reason I went to Harvard. It was a great liberal arts institution, and the undergraduates were the brightest. The same thing needs to happen with the IITs. The IITs get the brightest people of India. And I've been telling my friend Ambud Sagar at IIT Delhi, we really need to encourage this larger issue society. That doesn't mean everybody becomes that, but they at least appreciate the issues of ethics, of social consequences, and unintended consequences. So have I made that clear?
Absolutely. I think it's very interesting that you mentioned the point about communication, because that is really what I want to ask you next. In my previous conversations with you, you had mentioned about how strongly you feel about the importance of people like science communicators or public engagement practitioners who are actually taking the science to the masses and to societies. But essentially at the festival, we've spoken to two different types of scientists and researchers. One school of thought being that it's absolutely imperative to engage with audiences and publics because science is funded by the taxpayers' money. So it's absolutely a responsibility to engage with the audiences. However, the second school of thought, and some researchers and scientists have said that they already are engaged in so many different things on their level. Why does the onus of public engagement also have to fall on them? Why can't there be another mechanism that works in a manner that they don't have to compulsorily interact with public because they're not comfortable doing so? So what's your take on that?
Yeah, so I think this is a very complicated question. Okay. Let me just first say something else. We don't want every physicist and engineer to become just a public policy or communicator. But one thing they must realize, when we do our research, we are spending enormous hours, sometimes years, to come to some kind of conclusion. And we might write this paper in one day or a few days. Think a little bit as to how you communicate those results to your peers, just not to the general public. So some effort has to be spent in developing the right communication leadership skills. That's what the undergraduate education does need to be, that every engineer must learn how to write and read and write in a good way. That doesn't mean they become like you as a communicator, but they at least can describe the results to their colleagues properly. Very often these students don't realize how to give a talk before their colleagues, because not every colleague knows. When you do a PhD, you know more about the subject than anybody else. You got to explain it in some fashion. So that part is, so the ability to speak publicly at scientific conferences, those should be minimum requirement for everybody. But then there would be some people who are born with a larger gift of simplifying. You see, it is very important that the card-carrying physicist or engineer must be able to defend what they're doing or provide the uncertainties with their data. It is the evidence, but realize that that might change. So that's where, so we don't want to negate that ever. That's where the ethics and integrity come in properly. So, but same time, it is important that we have a subset of people who actually can do, they are the ones who eventually become the leaders, because they should make sure that they're able, that's what I meant. The leadership has to be insulated, that the researchers have to be insulated from the day-to-day politicians, because they, so what will happen with the pandemic, there needs to be some proper interface, and the leaders of the scientific establishment will be the subset of people, so the ones who actually want to work. So there are different grades here. Everyone needs to be a communicator with their fellow, at least in their immediate colleagues. But on the other hand, and even there will be some exceptions. There could be some people whom you know, there's always a Mozart or an Einstein. You just leave them alone because they need to be. That's another part of the stuff. But there are always a few of those, and they should not be thrown out. But the others, but it is important that you think about something deeply. So I was lucky that I could spend time. I had my credentials in physics. Now I can impact the others because the physicists won't throw me out. It's very important to me that the physicists and the engineers don't throw me out. So I think, so developing some credibility. So if you're a good communicator, we must really say, yes, this person really tells us the truth, is actually reliable and evidence-based. So it's very complicated, but I hope it gives you an idea you need. We don't want everyone to be able to defending this, but they should think, everyone should be thinking about the larger meta goals as to what they're doing. There are proximate goals where you just want to make some immediate, but it's just like a famous athlete. An athlete wants to win in the Olympics, but there are a whole bunch of proximate goals, controlling your weight, your diet, and all these other things. So you want to have the meta goal should be, what is it new and different that I'm going to do? That's the meta goal of research. The meta goal of development is to actually make it actually work, to actually remove all the uncertainties, and both are important. But you've got to realize what your meta goal is, and then you have proximate goals, and you allow the researcher to have flexibility to achieve the meta goals.
That's so interesting, Venki. The last part that you mentioned about the researcher having that flexibility. One of our panel discussions really focused on how research needs to be rethought completely, and it plays into this conversation very well, because your book is all about rethinking the nature and nurture of research. Now, there are so many very young science enthusiasts in the audience here today, and they've actually positioned a very good question. With your vast experience, how has your how has your personal take on research evolved over the years? And what is the one thing that young undergraduate students in, say, in STEM can take away from your experience in terms of which direction they should choose? And what would your advice be for these science enthusiasts to become better holistic thinkers? How can they improve upon their thinking process? Like you mentioned, ask questions, look at things holistically. How can we develop on skills and become better thinkers?
First of all, so I was dean. I'd been dean for 17 years between Santa Barbara and Harvard. And I learned long ago in my own personal experience that young people, some people are very definite. They want to do a certain thing. And there are many who change their minds. But however, what should happen for each one, it should be your passion. That you read, is this what really turns you on? So in the early stages, explore. That's the whole idea, of liberal education. I myself started at first as a theoretical physicist. Then I realized that was not my thing. I really wanted to do experiment and try things. So that's the first thing. Explore in your early stages. That's important in the education system. In India, too often you were stovepiped. I went to a liberal it's Stevens College, which taught me to debate and to be a member of other things. So I think there's a whole issue of Indian educational system which needs to be thought about. Then there's room for specialization, but there are too many specialized schools, but not these rather. But for the young people, the really bright people, follow your passion and explore. Take your little time in your undergraduate study to decide which is the area you really want to do. And on the other thing, every few years, do something different. You get stale after a point. In research, that's really important. In Bell Labs, every 5 or 10 years, and I felt that about my own career, even as a manager, as a leader. After 10 years, you've achieved as much as you can, and it's time for some fresh blood to come. So I think explore and go and see what turns you on. It may turn out that you really want to advance something in physics. There's nothing wrong with that. That's great. But have that meta goal, and you'll find that through exploration what really turns you on. So I think that's the other is, of course, you want to ultimately establish yourself where you're known in something. It could be in physics, it could be in engineering, it could be in communications, etc. And so over some period, and that should probably happen after your undergraduate career. There are always exceptions to the rule, right? But generally for the average person, and sometimes it usually happens after your postgraduate career that you really explore. Like people who even do theses. I decided I wanted, after my PhD, to do something different. That's why I went to Bell Labs, and that was great help. So what I'm saying is, don't follow exactly the same thing in your PhD thesis or your other. Find some other thesis advisor that automatically will teach you to broaden your horizon. So there's a whole bunch that the leaders, the professors must encourage their students broadly. That is, not just have one professor, but allow the students to collaborate with other professors. The culture becomes really important. And that culture where professors need to interact with each other and be part of the community. So the whole issues of the educational system, that culture had to change in Harvard. Harvard is now very different because it was really individual professor, the individual student. And the other thing, you might respect your mentor, but the students should not be afraid of asking questions of their professors. That's one thing about America. People would that's why I was much happier to be called just with Venki. You call your professor with your first name, or if you want to be really respectful, call him Professor Venki, but not in formal dear doctor and so on and so forth. So it just frees the thing so that you actually, and that should happen more and more, that you still respect your professor, but you can actually have a dialogue and a conversation. So I think there are a whole bunch of these issues. Some are cultural, some are actually what you learn. But for the young, passionate people, really, I actually think the IITs are great because they actually, just like Harvard was great because you got the very best people, but their education needs to be broadened so they can actually make this the greater impact. Not that they're not being good, but to make greater impact. So I hope this has helped answer that question.
Absolutely, Venki, that was really lovely. In the interest of time, are we okay to take 2 more questions, or do you have another engagement, Venki?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, great. So We have one very interesting question from the audience. From your personal experience, would you like to shed light on why there aren't many more institutions like the Bell Labs anymore? What can we do to bring back academia-industry collaboration that reached its zenith when such setups existed, but they don't really exist anymore outside of very big tech research setups? Yeah.
So I think this is one reason why we wrote the book is ineffective, and I'm still writing editorials on that. In fact, it will be coming out. You see, there are to do long-term research in a company, in an industrial organization. It is risky. It takes an appreciation of something which may actually affect the core business because it will completely upturn what you were doing. Bell Labs was a regulated monopoly, but it also had great leaders who realized that you needed technologists to think of the future communications industry, very long term. But it was also vertically integrated, namely the manufacturing all the way to the research and the communication people were one company. Over a period of time, Wall Street, United States developed a much more short term. Oh, Bell Labs invented the transistor, but by law, they're supposed to share it with everybody. So they didn't make any money off it. And people became much more profit sensitive to it. And then IBM started downsizing its research. DuPont started downsizing its research because you could not get the immediate benefit of the research. So that they become more and more product development organizations, because in fact, that's where the initial money is. So that's a very serious issue. And the other part is, in the case of Bell Labs, they separate the manufacturing from the other parts. That's what happened even with electricity. Edison supplied the power and also did the manufacturing. And eventually Edison got broken up, General Electric got broken up, and eventually you find a chaos. So I think there are whole issues of size and scale, and the philosophy of the Wall Street. So Wall Street in the United States is very short-sighted, and I don't know the Indian situation as much, but I do see large Indian companies need to invest much more and say a small part of your thing is a risk capital. If that doesn't happen, otherwise, there has to be some government lab which also has industrial output. That's what China has done in a big way. And the defense is that way. So in fact, somebody has to have the horsepower by that I mean the scale to actually fund this longer term work. So there are huge issues. In the United States, it's a great debate because there are people who don't believe the government should fund, and that is the job of the industry. But the industry won't do the longer term work. And ultimately, there has to be a new compact. China is doing that. In the defense, that's always been true. We always actually work the industry along with the government. But that needs to be the case for some of these other things. This is quite important in the Indian context. So there has to be that kind of change. And that's the conversation I'm trying to lead. I want to spend the last few years of my life actually changing this so that we actually create, and not that there are some lessons of the Bell Labs and the industrial labs which will stand the test of time, because creativity and technoscience, but some aspects will need to change with the time because fields have changed. You need to have, biology has different kinds of things, and you need to have new kind of institutions. That's what Janelia Farm is about. Harvard has made some new institutions like Broad Institute. India needs to have the whole university system along with industry has to be thought through in that new and holistic way and with new appropriate leaders. So I think that needs to happen, and great leaders will become important. And in the United States, fortunately, the private entrepreneurs, some of them have been good at it. They're funding this aspect, but the government is still a bottleneck because they don't have quite enough of the resources. Either the companies have to encourage to do that so they get some credit for it, just like Bell Labs did, or there has to be ones of that scale. And finally, with AI and machine learning becoming so important, actually, there has to be some kind of new compact. AI will never become really good unless it really understands how the human brain and neuroscience works. And in fact, I actually believe it has to be an adjunct. And in fact, the whole social construction of the technology will lead the generation of new kinds of Bell Labs, will encourage this interdisciplinary breaking of boundaries, etc. And that's for the very long-term future. But and in new areas like quantum computing, computing is going to change big time. And can't just be software. We just can't have Infosys and TCS. There needs to be the hardware side as well. So a whole bunch of issues need to have. That's being debated in the US right now. I'm writing articles. There's legislation in Congress on national innovation. And I don't know how to check out because not everybody agrees. It is a complex system. The political system says, and the business people say, leave us alone. The government doesn't know. But I think for a while, China might have actually figured this out. There is a balance. It is actually a combination of the private, the entrepreneurial, as well as the public. So there is this, it's a very delicate, it has to be, that's why you need leadership of the right kind. So there are times, and I think India is a great country, eventually leaders will arise. And same thing I think of the United States, that hopefully there is Elon Musk who actually has appended it. There are some great leaders, even in the private sector in the US today, and then even Google. DeepMind is a good example of what Google is doing. So there are new kinds of Bell Labs. That's Bell Labs 2.0, but there'll be a Bell Labs 3.0, which will actually have a deeper use. But social sciences will have to come in more intimately. Because in fact, that's what computing has done. Social media, that today there's debate, should we break up Google and Facebook? I'm not a fan of Facebook, but they should not be broken up. They need to be regulated. They need to be regulated, and they need to get a public service mission. It needs to be made clear, because there is this argument between free speech and all these other things. Somehow we got to come to terms, and there's talk of just breaking them up. If they break up, you'll have the same thing. Bell Labs will be gone, and the US will lose. I'm speaking now as an American. And the same thing is, so the public policy leaders have to understand the consequences of that. The economists have to understand the consequences of their actions. The very serious consequences. In the US, they said, we will let the manufacturing be all done in China. Of course, China did, that's what happened with the US. US did the manufacturing, Europe was doing the research, but then eventually the researchers moved to the US. Now the researchers are moving to China. So what we want to say, you have to view this holistically and not just view the short term. The short term, the US industry benefited because they could get all the products from China and they were doing the high-end work, but that's not going to be true longer. So this is very, very important. Therefore, India must have a strong manufacturing component. They may decide it is in biosciences with pandemics and vaccines, and because of space and other things, they lost the semiconductor business, and there they will rely on China, but they must be strategic and must invest in a way and still think of the long term. India has to be a great, and that's the case for US. I'm an American now, and that's what I'm fighting for. Even at my old age, that's what I'm writing an article every day on it and arguing with others. Oh, just let's leave the researchers alone and all these other things. So I don't know if I've answered your question.
No, you did. You definitely did. And, here's hoping that you mentioned the need of good leaders. Here's hoping that the attendees have really taken back something useful from this session. And here's hoping that some really significant leaders of the future are sitting with us in the audience today and will go on to do great things for SNT, for all of us. And Venki, with that, we've come to the end of the fireside chat. If I can ask you one last question before we end this session, slightly digressing from the book, but very important topic indeed. What do you think is the role of public engagement platforms such as India Science Festival in building bridges between science and society?
So I think this is, I'm actually want to compliment you on that we're actually reaching out and going very broadly. That's kind of important. And over a period of time, you'll be hopefully developing an ecosystem. And it's a complex system. We do let the individual flowers to bloom here, and and some of them will do different. There's not one single answer. It's multiplicity of answers. So I would encourage more and more of this. But at the same time, I do see the limitations. Maybe I'm an old person. I do believe that everything is human, that ultimately, one must never forget that the virtual world, the computing generation is extremely powerful tool, but it's an adjunct to humans. And therefore, the human interactions must, so how we hybridize, that is, it'll be time for us to meet personally. We actually engage with the students in person, eyeball to eyeball, which you can't quite do in this way, and hybridize, where you use the virtual technology to enhance that interaction. So I think eventually it'll evolve. I usually believe answers are hybrid, and the same thing will happen in a new compact between industry, the public sector, and universities. And there will not be one answer. There cannot be. It's a complex system, but the system must evolve with that. It can't be a monolithic communist system either. That's why I have hopes for India and the US that long term it'll actually come to pass. So I think don't object to everything which the Prime Minister might do, because in fact, some of things might need to change. So I don't know. Yes.
Yeah,
So
it's interesting.
I have enjoyed it very much. So I very much encourage you to continue this kind of dialogue, but also encourage the great individual entrepreneurs, the highly successful business people, to think about what some of the investments that they have made in our public institutions at the United States. That's been a strength of the United States. I came to Harvard because it had an endowment, because Bill Gates gave money for creating a computer science building. And so it is, and they should be, however, it still cannot be managed by those home entrepreneurs. They need to have a hands-off, they're given the money, but there's a certain philosophy. So that's beginning to happen, but needs to happen much more seriously with the very second. Tata's, I think, had in general a very good ethos in this. I hope many of the other successful ones, from Reliance to Mahindra to Infosys creates the Info Science Foundation, and I know Chris Kopalan and Narayan Murthy have been doing some of these other features. It's very important that they play an important role in this, because they, and in fact, they can be in biotechnology and other. So we need to really begin to think of those new compacts, of bringing them together in some fashion, because that's what will make India different from, say, China, but a little bit of the positives of which the United States has actually done well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
So keep encouraging that. Bring them in. Bring, in fact, Ambani and all of them into the conversation, so they actually learn to separate and actually develop within their own companies as well as relationships. They have their own competition.
Does come for the next session. Here's hoping Ambani does come for the next session and possibly funds the next festival.
Yeah, and you might get somebody from Tata's. Tata's do have a record, a tradition. Yeah. And I think Infosys is beginning to develop a bit of that tradition.
Yeah.
But they need to have so I think you really do want to keep encouraging that and grow that in a good way. That will be very important.
For sure. Actually, India Science Festival is associated with Social Alpha, which is one of the endeavors of the Tata Institutes. It's interesting that you mentioned the ecosystem, because I do know that Varun Agarwal, the founder of the festival, when he planned the festival and he thought of this public engagement platform, his vision was to bring together the entire ecosystem together to collaborate and move ahead. And he it in a very holistic manner, and here's hoping that we continue to keep doing this in the coming years and keep engaging with you in the coming years. Venki, this was an absolute pleasure. For all of our attendees, please do check out his book. We're going to drop a link in the chat. You can read all about his work. Venki.
Just as a point, by the way, the book is supposed to be published also by HarperCollins in India. And that will be a very cheap edition, which might be very valuable for some students. So I don't know what the Amazon is, but the HarperCollins edition, which I don't know when it's going to come out, it is supposed to be at a relatively modest price. This is not to sell my book. I don't make any money on it, but there are some important lessons there for it. Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Sure.
Okay,
thank you so much, Venki. Thank you. It was absolutely lovely chatting with you.
Okay, bye.
For all of our attendees, we are dropping a feedback form in the chat. You can tell us what you thought about this session, and we're very curious to know what you thought about the festival, and if there are any things that you think we can improve on. If you have any feedback for us, we're happy to incorporate all of it to make our events more engaging and exciting for everybody. Thank you for staying on a little longer than the intended time. I know we've run 18 minutes past schedule, but I'm just going to take another minute to tell you about a couple of more events that are going to happen at the festival. We have some very exciting talks, panels, workshops, contests, and competitions lined up for the next 15 days. The festival is running till the 23rd of January. It's online and absolutely free to attend. We have events for adults, young adults, as well as kids. So make sure to check out all of our events on the website. You can head over to the website, register. We're running on a single Zoom link. So all of our talks, panel discussions, and fireside chats happen on this link that you've joined. So you can just keep the link saved somewhere and tune into any of our sessions. We'd be happy to engage with everyone. And we also are very active on our social media channels. If the moderators can just drop a link, you can check us out on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, as well as YouTube. I know a lot of you wanted to know if the recording of this chat will be available. Very much so. You can head over to our YouTube channel, check out the events. All of our sessions will be put up on YouTube. Please do stay tuned for the next few days. All of our events are very, very exciting. You get to hear from top class researchers from all across the globe. This is an exciting opportunity to really get to know more about science, technology, innovation, science communication, science journalism. We have some very, very exciting topics lined up for you. And the best part about it is that it's absolutely free. So join us in this massive celebration of science and technology. Hope to see you all on the 11th. We have 3 very interesting talks lined up on the 11th, starting 6 p.m. in the evening. So make sure that you tune in for the same. I know there are a couple of questions that we couldn't take up. In the interest of time, we had to take only a few questions. So apologies for the same. Do tell us what you think about our events, and the feedback form is available in the chat. Thank you so much. Have a great night. And thank you for spending your Sunday with India Science Festival. Keep celebrating science.